Before Harry Potter ever set foot inside Hogwarts, long before the famous battles and the rise of Voldemort, there were creatures that quietly shaped the darker side of the wizarding world. Among them, none were more feared than the Dementors. These hooded beings drifted through the fortress of Azkaban, feeding not on flesh, but on hope itself. For centuries, they guarded the wizarding world's most notorious prison, leaving countless witches and wizards broken by despair. Yet their story stretches far beyond prison walls. To understand Dementors, we must look back through the history of magic, where their presence slowly grew into one of the wizarding world's darkest secrets. Dementors are among the most mysterious entities that exist anywhere in the wizarding world. Unlike dragons, trolls, or even werewolves, they do not fit neatly into the usual categories of magical creatures. They are not simply beasts that can be studied, catalogued, and understood through observation. In fact, even the Ministry of Magic has long struggled to classify them in any clear way. What exactly a Dementor is, where it truly came from, and how it first appeared in the wizarding world are questions that have never been fully answered. What is known with certainty is that Dementors seem to exist in places where human suffering gathers. Wherever despair grows deep and persistent, they appear as if drawn to it. Their presence chills the air, darkens the surroundings, and gradually drains happiness from anyone unfortunate enough to be near them. Wizards and witches who have studied them for centuries have come to the unsettling conclusion that Dementors do not merely cause misery. Instead, they seem to thrive on it. Some scholars believe that Dementors may not have been created in the way most magical creatures are. Dragons, for example, can trace their existence through breeding populations and natural habitats. Hippogriffs reproduce in ways that can be observed and understood. Dementors, however, do not appear to reproduce in any ordinary sense. They seem to multiply in response to despair itself. The greater the concentration of misery, the greater their numbers become. This has led many historians of magic to suggest that Dementors might actually be manifestations of human suffering rather than traditional creatures. According to this theory, they are not born but formed, shaped by the emotional darkness that accumulates in certain places. Over time, that darkness condenses into something physical, something capable of movement and intention. If that idea is true, then Dementors are not simply inhabitants of dark places. They are the result of those places. The wizarding world has struggled with this possibility for centuries because it implies something deeply uncomfortable. If Dementors truly emerge from concentrated despair, then their existence reflects the darker side of wizarding society itself. They would not be invaders from some unknown wilderness. Instead, they would be the shadows cast by human cruelty, fear, and suffering. Despite these unsettling theories, attempts to study Dementors directly have always proven difficult. Their presence affects the mind in powerful ways. Wizards, who spend extended periods near them, often report an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and hopelessness. Happy memories become distant and difficult to recall. Confidence fades. Even the strongest minds can struggle to maintain clear thought. Because of this effect, very few researchers have been able to examine Dementors closely. The rare descriptions that do exist tend to agree on certain physical characteristics. Dementors are tall, cloaked figures that appear to glide rather than walk. Their bodies remain hidden beneath tattered robes, and their faces are concealed by deep hoods. From beneath those sleeves emerge thin, grey hands that resemble something halfway between decayed flesh and bone. Yet even these descriptions remain incomplete. Some observers claim that Dementors do not truly have a solid body at all. Instead, they appear to be something closer to living shadows, wrapped in fabric that barely contains them. The robes that hang from their forms are often described as rotting or damp, as if they have absorbed the decay of the places they inhabit. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Dementors is the cold that surrounds them. Their presence does not simply lower the temperature in the ordinary sense. It feels as though warmth itself is being removed from the world. Fires burn weaker, breath forms clouds in the air, frost spreads across nearby surfaces, Wizards who have encountered them often describe the sensation as if winter itself has suddenly arrived. Along with the cold comes a deep and oppressive silence. The sounds of ordinary life seem to fade away when Dementors draw near. Laughter stops, conversation slows. The natural energy of a place drains away until only stillness remains. In that silence, people begin to feel something far more dangerous than fear. They begin to feel despair. This emotional effect is the true power of Dementors. Rather than attacking their victims physically, they feed on the positive emotions that sustain the human mind. Happiness, hope, and comfort are gradually consumed, leaving behind only the darkest memories a person has ever experienced. Those memories rise to the surface with frightening clarity. A witch might suddenly recall the loss of a loved one she had tried for years to forget. A wizard might relive a moment of shame or failure that had once haunted him in childhood. Under the influence of a Dementor, such memories become vivid and unavoidable. It becomes almost impossible to think of anything else. Over time, this constant reliving of painful experiences breaks down even the strongest individuals. Some prisoners exposed to Dementors for years eventually lose the ability to remember happiness at all. Without those memories to protect them, they fall into a state of emotional emptiness. Their minds remain alive, but the sense of purpose that once drove them disappears. This effect explains why Dementors are so rarely confronted directly. Unlike creatures that can be fought with spells or weapons, their power operates on a deeper level. They weaken their victims before any physical confrontation can even begin. By the time a wizard gathers the strength to resist, the Dementor has already begun feeding. Because of this unusual nature, many magical historians believe Dementors cannot truly be destroyed. Ordinary spells seem to have little effect on them. Blasting curses pass through their forms without causing lasting harm. Physical barriers mean little to creatures that move through the air like drifting smoke. Instead of killing Dementors, the wizarding world has traditionally relied on controlling their movement. If they can be confined to a specific location, their danger becomes somewhat manageable. This strategy has shaped wizarding policy for centuries, especially in regard to the one place where Dementors gathered in overwhelming numbers. But long before the Ministry of Magic attempted to contain them, Dementors already existed somewhere in the wizarding world. Their earliest appearances are tied to one of the darkest locations ever discovered by magical authorities. It was a fortress hidden far out at sea, a place surrounded by cold water and constant storms. That fortress would eventually become the most feared prison in wizarding Britain. Yet when it was first discovered, it was not a prison at all. It was something far more disturbing, and it was already filled with Dementors. Far out in the cold waters of the North Sea lies a small, jagged island that most maps of the wizarding world once refused to acknowledge. The sea around it is rough, the winds are constant, and for centuries even experienced sailors avoided the area. Ships that passed too close often reported strange feelings of dread, as if the island itself carried a weight that pressed down on the mind. Long before the fortress of Azkaban became the wizarding world's most feared prison, the island already had a reputation that few people fully understood. The earliest known connection between this island and the wizarding world comes from the time of a dark wizard named Ecrizdis. Very little is known about him even today. Historical records about Ecrizdis are unusually scarce, which has led many historians to believe that much of what happened on the island was deliberately erased. What can be pieced together suggests that Ecrizdis was not simply another practitioner of dark magic. He appears to have been fascinated by suffering itself. Ecrizdis constructed a fortress on the island sometime during the early centuries of wizarding history. The structure was built from heavy stone and designed more like a stronghold than a home. High walls surrounded a central tower, and narrow windows looked out across the grey sea. There were no welcoming halls or comfortable living spaces. Instead, the fortress seemed designed to isolate anyone inside it from the rest of the world. But the most disturbing aspect of Ecrizdis's fortress was not the architecture, it was what he did there. Ecrizdis was known to lure Muggle sailors to the island. Ships traveling across the North Sea would sometimes vanish without explanation, and it is believed that Ecrizdis used powerful enchantments to draw them toward the rocky shoreline. Once the sailors reached the island, they were trapped. The wizard then used them for experiments involving some of the darkest branches of magic. Exactly what those experiments involved remains unclear, but fragments of old magical investigations suggest they centered on fear, despair, and the manipulation of the human mind. Ecrizdis appeared to be exploring how suffering could be intensified, controlled, and possibly even transformed into magical energy. Some accounts claim that the fortress became a place of constant torment, where victims were forced to endure prolonged psychological horror rather than quick death. If these accounts are even partially true, the island must have become saturated with despair over time. The cries of prisoners, the terror of captured sailors, and the twisted curiosity of the wizard who held them there would have created an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in the wizarding world. And it is precisely around this point in history that the earliest references to Dementors begin to appear. Some historians believe that Ecrizdis deliberately attempted to summon them. Others believe he may have accidentally created the conditions that allowed them to form. Whatever the case may be, the fortress on the island soon became home to creatures that thrived on the misery within its walls. After years of strange disappearances at sea, the wizarding authorities eventually became aware that something unnatural was happening. A group of ministry representatives was sent to investigate the island. By the time they arrived, however, Ecrizdis was already dead. His death remains one of the many mysteries surrounding the fortress. There were no witnesses, and no clear signs of struggle were ever recorded. Some historians believe that the Dark Wizard may have been consumed by the very forces he had been experimenting with. Others suggest that the creatures drawn to the island may have turned on him once his control weakened. Whatever the truth may be, the investigators who reached the island encountered something they had never seen before. The fortress was still standing, but it was no longer simply a ruin left behind by a dead wizard. The air around it felt unnaturally cold. The atmosphere was thick with the same oppressive despair that later generations would associate with Azkaban prison, and inside the fortress, gliding silently through the corridors, were Dementors. The investigators quickly realized that the creatures had spread throughout the entire structure. They moved slowly through the dark halls, drifting past broken doors and abandoned chambers. The feeling of hopelessness inside the fortress was so strong that several members of the investigative group were forced to retreat before they could fully examine the island. What frightened the ministry officials most was the realization that the Dementors did not appear to be leaving. The creatures had settled into the fortress as if it were their natural habitat. The emotional darkness that filled the island seemed to sustain them, and the longer the investigators remained there, the stronger the Dementors' presence became. Attempts were made to drive them away using defensive magic, but the results were disappointing. While certain spells could repel them temporarily, none of the investigators possessed the strength required to remove them entirely. The creatures simply drifted back once the magical pressure faded. This discovery presented the ministry with an enormous problem. The island itself had become dangerous enough that it could not simply be ignored. At the same time, removing the Dementors seemed almost impossible. Even approaching the fortress required powerful protective magic and careful preparation. For a time, the ministry considered sealing the island off entirely. Some officials suggested placing permanent protective enchantments around the surrounding waters to prevent ships from approaching. Others believed the fortress should be destroyed in hopes that the Dementors might disperse without a place to gather. But neither option offered a clear solution. Destroying the fortress would not necessarily remove the creatures living inside it. If anything, it might allow them to spread across the coastline of Britain, and sealing the island off completely would only delay the problem rather than solve it. As the ministry debated what to do, one fact became increasingly clear. The Dementors were not temporary visitors to the island. They had claimed the fortress as their territory. Over time, the creatures multiplied within its walls. The despair left behind by Ekrasdis's victims had created an environment where they could thrive. The island's isolation prevented outside interference, and the dark reputation surrounding the fortress ensured that very few people would attempt to approach it. In many ways, the fortress had become a perfect home for them. And it was this unsettling reality that eventually led the Ministry of Magic to make one of the most controversial decisions in wizarding history. Instead of trying to eliminate the Dementors, they would attempt to use them. The fortress that had once been a dark wizard's private laboratory would soon be transformed into something entirely different. It would become the wizarding world's most secure prison, and the creatures that haunted its corridors would become its guards. When the Ministry of Magic first discovered the fortress on the island in the North Sea, the situation immediately became one of the most complicated magical problems they had ever faced. The island could not simply be ignored. It had already been the source of unexplained disappearances, and the fortress itself was filled with creatures that no wizard truly understood. Yet removing the Dementors proved far more difficult than anyone expected. The first investigators who reached the island did not stay long. Even powerful witches and wizards, trained in defensive magic, struggled to remain inside the fortress for extended periods. The cold surrounding the Dementors seeped into the bones, and the emotional pressure they created made clear thinking difficult. Members of the investigative group reported sudden waves of despair, memories surfacing from years earlier, and an overwhelming urge to abandon the place entirely. Despite these conditions, the ministry sent additional teams over the following months. Each group attempted different approaches to dealing with the creatures that now filled the fortress. Some researchers believed Dementors might behave like other magical beasts, and therefore could be driven away through magical barriers or confinement spells. Others hoped that if the creatures were deprived of the despair they fed upon, they might eventually disperse on their own. Neither theory proved successful. The Dementors did not respond to the fortress as if it were simply a physical shelter. Their connection to the island appeared to be far deeper. The entire environment seemed to sustain them. Even when investigators attempted to force them into particular areas of the fortress using powerful charms, the creatures would slowly drift back once the spells weakened. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when ministry officials attempted to clear the outer areas of the island. If Dementors could be removed from the shoreline, it was hoped that the fortress might at least be isolated. Yet when the investigators drove several Dementors away from the main structure, the creatures did not flee out across the sea. Instead, they circled the island, gliding through the air before gradually returning. It became clear that the island itself had become their territory. This realization created a difficult dilemma for the Ministry of Magic. If the Dementors could not be removed from the island, then the ministry had to decide whether it was safer to leave them there or attempt to eliminate them entirely. The idea of destroying them was appealing in theory, but no wizard could explain how such a task might actually be accomplished. Traditional combat spells seemed to pass harmlessly through the creatures. Powerful curses had little effect. Even spells designed to repel dark entities only pushed them back temporarily. The only magic known to truly drive Dementors away was the Patronus charm, but producing a strong Patronus required an unusually high level of magical skill. Even among experienced wizards, only a small number could maintain the charm long enough to control large groups of Dementors. Trying to eradicate them all would have required dozens of highly skilled witches and wizards working together continuously, and even then, there was no guarantee the creatures would not simply return once the effort ended. Some officials worried that if the ministry attempted to destroy them and failed, the Dementors might spread across the coastline in search of new sources of despair. Others feared something even worse. If Dementors truly multiplied wherever misery gathered, forcing them out of the island might cause them to drift toward human settlements. The emotional suffering present in large wizarding communities could provide exactly the environment they needed to grow stronger. Instead of containing the creatures on a remote island, the ministry might accidentally unleash them upon the wider wizarding world. As debates continued, another question emerged that troubled many ministry officials. What exactly would happen to the Dementors if they were removed from the island completely? No one knew where such creatures truly belonged. They had no known homeland and no natural habitat outside of places filled with intense despair. If the island fortress was destroyed, the Dementors might simply disperse across Britain in search of new territory. Gradually, the ministry began to realize that the island itself had become a kind of natural prison for the creatures. Its remote location in the stormy North Sea made travel difficult. Muggle ships rarely ventured close, and wizarding traffic in the region was almost non-existent. As long as the Dementors remained confined there, the rest of the wizarding world was relatively safe from their influence. This realization slowly shifted the conversation within the ministry. Instead of asking how the Dementors could be removed, officials began asking how they might be controlled. The idea was unsettling from the beginning. Dementors were not creatures that could be reasoned with in the ordinary sense. They had no interest in wizarding law or authority. Their motivations were simple and deeply unsettling. They existed to feed on human happiness and to consume despair. Yet some ministry officials believed that this very nature might make them useful. If Dementors fed on despair, then the fortress on the island might provide them with a constant supply. Criminals imprisoned there would create the emotional environment the creatures desired. In exchange, the Dementors would remain on the island rather than spreading elsewhere. It was not a comfortable solution. Many witches and wizards within the ministry argued strongly against the idea. Using creatures that thrived on human suffering as prison guards raised serious ethical concerns. Some believed that allowing Dementors to feed on prisoners amounted to a form of torture. Others pointed out that the wizarding world had very few alternatives. Secure magical prisons were difficult to maintain, especially when dealing with dangerous dark wizards capable of powerful spells. Ordinary guards could be bribed, threatened, or magically controlled. Dementors, on the other hand, had no interest in gold or politics. Their only concern was the despair they consumed. Supporters of the plan argued that the creatures would create the most secure prison imaginable. Any wizard attempting to escape would first have to overcome the crushing hopelessness caused by the Dementors themselves. Even the strongest criminals might struggle to maintain the willpower needed to perform complex magic under those conditions. Eventually, practicality began to outweigh hesitation. The ministry could not eliminate the Dementors, and leaving them on the island without supervision would remain dangerous. By turning the fortress into a prison, the ministry could at least place the creatures within a structured system. Over time, this idea developed into a formal proposal. The fortress would be rebuilt and reinforced. Magical defenses would be placed around the island to prevent unauthorized travel. Prisoners convicted of serious crimes would be transported there and confined within the stone walls. The Dementors, drawn by the constant despair created by the prisoners, would remain within the fortress and serve as its guardians. It was a grim solution, but it promised stability. When the decision was finally made, the island fortress began a transformation that would change wizarding history for centuries to come. What had once been the private laboratory of a dark wizard would soon become the most feared prison in magical Britain. And the creatures that haunted its corridors would become something far more official. They would become the guards of Azkaban. Before the island fortress in the North Sea became the prison known as Azkaban, the wizarding world already had methods for dealing with criminals. For centuries, witches and wizards who broke magical law were confined in various locations across Britain. Some were held in magically secured cells beneath ministry buildings. Others were placed under house arrest through binding enchantments. In particularly dangerous cases, dark wizards were kept under constant supervision by aurors. These earlier systems worked reasonably well when dealing with ordinary crimes. However, as the centuries passed and dark magic grew more complex, the Ministry of Magic faced an increasing challenge. Powerful dark wizards could escape conventional confinement far more easily than ordinary prisoners. Some could vanish through magical transportation, Others used charms to manipulate their guards or bend the minds of those watching them. The wizarding world gradually learned that imprisoning someone with advanced magical ability required far more than simply locking them behind a door. By the time the island fortress was discovered in the North Sea, the Ministry had already experienced several dangerous prison escapes. Some dark wizards had managed to overpower guards, while others had taken advantage of weaknesses in magical security. Each escape reminded the Ministry that a more reliable system was needed. The fortress, built by Echrisdis, presented an opportunity, though it was one surrounded by unease. Its remote location made escape far more difficult than any prison on the mainland. The surrounding sea was cold and violent, with storms that could easily destroy small boats. Even strong swimmers would struggle to survive the journey back to shore. But what truly made the fortress unique was not the island itself. It was the presence of Dementors. The Ministry had already concluded that removing the creatures would be nearly impossible. At the same time, their ability to drain hope and weaken the human mind created an unusual form of security. Prisoners surrounded by Dementors would find it extremely difficult to focus their thoughts, let alone perform complicated spells. This realization slowly shaped the Ministry's final decision. Instead of constructing a completely new prison somewhere else, the Ministry would transform the existing fortress into a permanent facility for holding the most dangerous criminals in the wizarding world. The island would become a place of punishment and containment, and the Dementors would serve as its guardians. The transformation began with a series of structural changes to the fortress itself. The original building, left behind by Echrisdis, had been designed for his private experiments rather than organized confinement. Many rooms were irregular in shape, and some areas had collapsed over time. Ministry workers reinforced the walls, repaired the towers, and created rows of stone cells throughout the structure. The design was deliberately simple. Thick stone corridors ran through the fortress like veins, connecting the central tower with outer chambers and narrow stairways. Each cell was sealed with heavy magical barriers that prevented prisoners from using spells to break free. The walls were enchanted to resist blasting curses and other destructive magic. Yet even with these precautions, the Ministry understood that the true security of the prison did not come from stone or enchantments. It came from the Dementors drifting through the corridors. Unlike ordinary guards, the creatures did not need rest, wages, or supervision. They glided silently through the fortress, moving between cells and gathering wherever despair was strongest. Their presence ensured that prisoners rarely had the strength to plan an escape, much less carry one out. This system of containment quickly proved effective. When the first prisoners were transported to the island, Ministry officials observed how rapidly the environment inside the fortress changed. Even experienced dark wizards began to show signs of emotional exhaustion after only a short time inside the prison. The constant proximity of Dementors slowly stripped away their confidence and resistance. Some prisoners lost the will to speak. Others spent long hours sitting motionless in their cells, trapped in memories they could not escape. The fortress became a place where time seemed to slow, measured not by days, but by the gradual fading of hope. News of the prison spread quickly throughout the wizarding community. The name Azkaban soon became synonymous with terror. Parents warned their children about the fate of those who practiced dark magic, while adult witches and wizards spoke the name of the prison in quiet voices. It was not merely the idea of imprisonment that frightened people. It was the knowledge of what waited inside the fortress. For many criminals, being sent to Azkaban meant more than losing freedom. It meant facing the relentless presence of creatures that fed on despair. Even those who had committed terrible crimes feared the thought of spending years surrounded by Dementors. Despite this fear, the Ministry continued to rely on the prison as its primary method of containing dangerous individuals. The system seemed to work. Escapes were extremely rare, and the island's isolation ensured that even if a prisoner managed to flee the fortress itself, reaching the mainland would remain nearly impossible. Over time, Azkaban became deeply integrated into the structure of wizarding law. Trials conducted by the Ministry often ended with the same sentence for those found guilty of serious crimes. The condemned wizard or witch would be transported across the cold sea and placed inside the stone walls of the prison. From that moment forward, their lives would be defined by the presence of the Dementors. Yet, the decision to rely on such creatures was never entirely comfortable for the wizarding world. Some officials within the Ministry continued to question the morality of the arrangement. They argued that allowing Dementors to feed on prisoners crossed an ethical boundary that civilized magical society should never approach. Others insisted that the alternative would be far worse. Without the prison, powerful dark wizards might roam free, threatening innocent lives. Azkaban, grim as it was, provided a barrier between those individuals and the rest of society. As the years passed, the fortress became more than a prison. It became a symbol of the wizarding world's struggle to maintain order in the face of dark magic. Its tall towers rising from the sea reminded everyone that the Ministry was willing to take extreme measures to protect its people. But hidden within that decision was a quiet danger. By depending so heavily on the Dementors, the Ministry had tied the stability of its prison system to creatures that could never truly be controlled. The fortress might contain criminals, but it also sustained the very beings that fed upon despair. And as the number of prisoners inside Azkaban slowly increased, so too did the number of Dementors drifting through its dark corridors. Once Azkaban was fully established as the wizarding world's primary prison, the true nature of the Dementors' role inside the fortress became clear. They were not simply guards in the traditional sense. They did not patrol the corridors, looking for misbehavior, or stand watch at the doors of individual cells. Instead, their presence filled the entire prison like a slow-moving fog, spreading through every hallway and chamber until no prisoner could escape their influence. For those confined within the stone walls of Azkaban, the experience of living alongside Dementors was unlike any ordinary form of imprisonment. Physical chains were rarely necessary. Magical barriers sealed the cells, but it was the emotional pressure created by the Dementors that truly held prisoners in place. The first effect most prisoners noticed was the cold. It was not the natural chill of sea air seeping through the fortress walls. The cold brought by Dementors felt different, deeper somehow, as if the warmth inside the body itself was slowly being drained away. Breath turned visible even in rooms where fires burned, and frost sometimes crept along the stone floors. Many prisoners reported that no matter how tightly they wrapped themselves in blankets, the cold remained. Along with the cold came a constant sense of exhaustion. Prisoners, who had once been powerful witches or wizards, found it difficult to concentrate on even the simplest thoughts. Spells that once came easily to them seemed distant and unreachable. The effort required to focus on a single idea became overwhelming. This mental fatigue was only the beginning. As the Dementors glided silently through the corridors outside the cells, prisoners began to experience something far more disturbing. Memories they had tried to bury would rise to the surface of their minds without warning. Moments of pain, loss, guilt, or fear would return with a clarity that felt almost physical. A prisoner might suddenly hear the voice of someone they had failed long ago. Another might relive a moment of humiliation or betrayal. These memories did not fade quickly. Under the influence of the Dementors, they repeated again and again, growing sharper each time. The creatures fed on the emotional energy produced by these memories. Happiness and hope were gradually drained away, leaving only the darkest experiences behind. For many prisoners, this created a terrible cycle. The more painful memories they relived, the stronger the Dementors seemed to become. In the early years of Azkaban's operation, Ministry officials occasionally visited the prison to inspect conditions. Many of these visitors left the island shaken by what they had witnessed. Even brief exposure to the Dementors was enough to leave them feeling hollow and uneasy for days afterward. Some officials returned from the island convinced that Azkaban was necessary despite its cruelty. Others argued that the prison had crossed a line that the wizarding world should never have approached. Yet the ministry continued to send prisoners there, believing that the security provided by the Dementors outweighed the moral cost. Inside the fortress, the long-term effects on prisoners were devastating. Over time, many inmates began to lose their ability to remember happy experiences at all. Without those memories to anchor them, their sense of identity slowly faded. Some prisoners stopped speaking entirely, sitting in silence as the years passed. Others muttered constantly to themselves, trapped in fragments of memory that only they could see. The corridors of Azkaban became filled with echoes of despair. A wizard, who had once commanded powerful dark magic, might spend hours staring at the wall of his cell, unable to summon the strength even to stand. A witch, who had once plotted elaborate crimes, might now tremble whenever a Dementor drifted past the doorway. The creatures did not hurry. They moved slowly, drifting through the fortress with patient inevitability. Their very presence ensured that the emotional atmosphere of the prison remained saturated with suffering. Because of this environment, many prisoners lost the desire to escape. This fact surprised some ministry officials during the early years of the prison. Normally, criminals confined in secure facilities would spend their time searching for weaknesses in the system. They would study the behavior of guards, test magical barriers, and quietly gather resources for an eventual escape. In Azkaban, however, such efforts were extremely rare. The influence of the Dementors made long-term planning almost impossible. Prisoners who tried to focus on escape often found their minds slipping back into painful memories instead. The emotional energy required to maintain determination simply drained away under the constant pressure of the creatures. As a result, the prison developed a reputation as a place where hope itself could not survive. Stories began to circulate throughout the wizarding world about prisoners who entered Azkaban strong and defiant, but emerged years later as shadows of their former selves. Some former inmates, after finally being released, spoke about the fortress in quiet, trembling voices. They described nights filled with memories they could not escape and days that seemed to stretch endlessly into grey silence. Even the most hardened criminals feared being sent there. This fear strengthened the ministry's belief that Azkaban served an important purpose. The prison did more than simply contain dangerous individuals. It also acted as a warning to anyone tempted to practice dark magic. The thought of spending years surrounded by Dementors was enough to discourage many would-be criminals before they ever acted. Yet beneath this practical success lay a troubling truth. The Dementors did not distinguish between crimes or intentions. To them, every prisoner was simply another source of emotional energy. Whether a witch had committed terrible acts or had been wrongly accused mattered little to the creatures drifting through the fortress. They fed on despair wherever they found it, and as the population of Azkaban slowly grew over the decades, the fortress became a place where misery gathered in greater and greater concentrations. Each new prisoner added another mind filled with memories for the Dementors to consume. The creatures thrived in that environment. Their numbers slowly increased, gliding through the dark corridors and gathering in the towers that overlooked the cold sea. The prison continued to function as the ministry intended, but it also became something else. It became the largest gathering place of Dementors in the wizarding world, and for the prisoners trapped inside its walls, that meant one thing above all else. There was no escape from despair. For most witches and wizards, the first time they hear about Dementors is long before they ever see one. Stories about the creatures circulate quietly throughout the wizarding world, passed from parents to children and whispered among students at Hogwarts. These stories often describe hooded figures gliding through the darkness, but the true appearance of a Dementor is something far more unsettling than most people imagine. Unlike many magical creatures, Dementors do not move with the clear physical presence of an animal or human. They drift through the air with slow, deliberate motion, their long robes trailing behind them like torn shadows. Their bodies are tall and thin, though it is difficult to say exactly how tall. because they rarely stand upright in the way a person would. Instead, they float slightly above the ground, as though gravity itself barely affects them. The robes they wear appear ancient and decayed. Observers often describe the fabric as black or dark grey, though its exact colour seems to shift depending on the surrounding light. The cloth hangs loosely over their forms, concealing whatever shape might lie beneath. At the edges of the robes, the material looks worn and tattered, as if it has been slowly rotting for years. These robes serve an important purpose. They hide the most disturbing part of the creature. A Dementor's face is almost never seen clearly. The deep hood covering its head casts a permanent shadow over its features. Those who have come close enough to glimpse beneath the hood describe something that hardly resembles a human face at all. The skin appears grey and shriveled, stretched tightly across the skull. Where eyes might normally be, there is only darkness. Many witnesses have said that looking into the hollow space beneath a Dementor's hood creates an immediate sense of dread, as if the creature's emptiness is reaching out toward the viewer. This effect is not simply psychological. The presence of a Dementor seems to weaken the mind's natural defenses against fear. From the sleeves of their robes extend hands that are equally unsettling. These hands are long and skeletal, their fingers thin and pale like dead branches. The skin appears dry and decayed, giving the impression that the creature has existed for far longer than any living being should. Yet despite their fragile appearance, these hands move with surprising control. Dementors often stretch their fingers slowly through the air as they glide, as if feeling the emotional atmosphere around them. Wizards who have studied their behavior believe that Dementors do not rely on ordinary senses like sight or hearing. Instead, they seem to detect emotions directly. Happiness, hope, and human warmth act like signals to them. These feelings draw the creatures closer in the same way that the scent of food attracts ordinary animals. A room filled with laughter and joy might be irresistible to a nearby Dementor, not because of any physical sound, but because of the emotional energy present. This unusual way of sensing the world explains why Dementors rarely show interest in their physical surroundings. They glide past walls and furniture without hesitation, navigating entirely through the emotional landscape around them. To a Dementor, a corridor filled with despair is far more noticeable than the stone walls that contain it. Along with their eerie appearance comes another unmistakable sign of their presence: the cold. Whenever a Dementor enters an area, the temperature drops dramatically. This change does not happen slowly. The air seems to lose its warmth almost instantly. Breath becomes visible, and frost can appear on nearby surfaces even when fires are burning. Many witches and wizards who have encountered Dementors say the cold feels unnatural, as if the warmth is not simply being pushed away, but actively removed. It is a sensation that reaches deep into the body, leaving muscles stiff and fingers numb. At the same time, light itself appears to fade. Rooms that were once well lit become dim and shadowed. Colors lose their brightness, and the world begins to look grey and lifeless. This effect creates the strange impression that the Dementor is carrying darkness with it wherever it goes. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their movement is the silence. Dementors do not speak, and they rarely make any sound at all. When they glide through the air, their robes rustle faintly, but the noise is soft enough that it can easily be missed. In many cases, people realize a Dementor is nearby only after the cold has already begun to spread. Because of this silence, their arrival often feels sudden and overwhelming. A room that moments earlier felt ordinary can quickly transform into a place filled with dread. Conversations falter, laughter fades, and people find themselves growing uneasy without understanding why. Even experienced witches and wizards struggle to remain calm under these conditions. The instinct to move away from the creature becomes almost impossible to ignore. Yet the Dementor itself remains patient. It drifts slowly through the space, its hooded head turning slightly as if searching for the strongest source of emotion nearby. The skeletal hands stretch forward, reaching through the cold air with deliberate calm. Observers have sometimes described this moment as the most terrifying part of encountering a Dementor. The creature does not rush or attack in the frantic way many dangerous beasts might. Instead, it approaches with quiet certainty, as though it knows that resistance will soon fade. This calm, inevitable movement is what gives Dementors their haunting presence. They are not creatures of sudden violence. They are creatures of slow despair. And anyone who stands close enough to see the hollow darkness beneath that hood soon understands why the wizarding world has feared them for centuries. Among all the powers attributed to Dementors, none is more feared than the act known throughout the wizarding world as the Dementor's kiss. It is a punishment so severe that even hardened criminals speak of it in quiet voices. While most prisoners sent to Azkaban must endure years of despair under the watch of the creatures, the kiss represents something far worse. It is not simply imprisonment or suffering. It is the complete destruction of what makes a person human. The name itself can sound strangely gentle to those who hear it for the first time. A kiss is normally associated with affection or comfort, but the act performed by a Dementor carries a very different meaning. When the creature delivers the kiss, it removes the victim's soul. This process begins slowly. The Dementor draws closer to its target, gliding forward until it stands directly before the victim. The air grows colder with every moment. Those who have witnessed the event describe the atmosphere becoming so heavy that breathing itself feels difficult. Once close enough, the Dementor raises its hood. Very few people have ever seen what lies fully beneath that hood, and those who have rarely speak about it in detail. Accounts suggest that the creature's mouth opens wider than any human mouth should, stretching unnaturally as it prepares to perform the kiss. The victim, already weakened by the creature's presence, often finds it impossible to resist. The Dementor presses its mouth against the victim's face and begins to draw out something invisible yet unmistakably real. Witnesses describe the sensation as if a powerful force is pulling something from deep within the body. The process does not appear violent in the usual sense. There is no blood or physical damage. Instead, the victim simply collapses once the act is complete. What the Dementor takes cannot be restored. In wizarding understanding, the soul represents the core of a person's identity. It contains memories, emotions, personality, and the spark of consciousness that makes life meaningful. When a Dementor removes the soul, the body remains alive, but the mind is left empty. Those who have suffered the kiss do not die. Their hearts continue to beat. Their lungs continue to breathe. Yet everything that made them a thinking, feeling individual is gone. The body becomes little more than a living shell, incapable of thought or emotion. For this reason, the Dementor's kiss is widely considered worse than death. Death, at least, allows the soul to move on to whatever lies beyond life. The kiss traps the body in a permanent state of emptiness, leaving the victim in a condition from which there is no recovery. Because of the horror associated with this act, the Ministry of Magic has historically treated the kiss as an extreme punishment. It is not carried out automatically. Instead, it must be authorized under very specific circumstances, usually when a criminal is considered so dangerous that ordinary imprisonment is no longer considered sufficient. Even then, the decision has always been controversial. Many witches and wizards believe that no authority should possess the power to destroy a soul. Some argue that even the worst criminals should not be subjected to such a fate. Others believe the punishment serves as a necessary deterrent, particularly when dealing with dark wizards capable of causing immense harm. Throughout the history of Azkaban, the kiss has been used sparingly. The Ministry understands that once it is carried out, there is no possibility of reversing the act. The victim will never regain awareness, and no magical healing can restore what has been taken. Despite its rarity, the mere possibility of the kiss plays a powerful role in maintaining control over prisoners. Knowing that such a punishment exists creates an additional layer of fear within the prison walls. For the Dementors themselves, the kiss represents something different. It is not an act of justice or discipline. It is simply the most intense form of feeding available to them. While they normally sustain themselves by draining happiness and hope, the kiss provides a concentrated source of emotional energy. The soul contains everything that makes a person capable of feeling joy or despair. When a Dementor consumes it, the creature experiences a surge of satisfaction far greater than what it receives from ordinary feeding. This explains why the creatures respond eagerly when the ministry authorizes the kiss. To them, it is not a grim responsibility, it is an opportunity. The knowledge of this fact makes many witches and wizards deeply uncomfortable. It reminds them that the prison system of Azkaban relies on creatures whose motivations are entirely separate from human morality. Dementors do not care about justice. They do not understand the difference between guilt and innocence. They respond only to emotional energy. If the ministry were ever to lose control of them, there would be nothing preventing the creatures from performing the kiss on anyone they encountered. This possibility has haunted many officials who have worked closely with Azkaban over the years. In practice, strict rules have usually governed when the kiss can be used. Auras assigned to the prison monitor the Dementors carefully, ensuring that the creatures do not act without authorization. Even so, the system depends heavily on the assumption that the Dementors will obey the ministry's commands. For many years, this arrangement appeared stable. The creatures remained within the fortress, feeding on the despair of prisoners and carrying out the kiss only when instructed. The wizarding world accepted the situation as an unpleasant but necessary part of maintaining order. Yet beneath this uneasy balance lay a troubling truth. The Dementors had never truly belonged to the ministry. They had simply tolerated its authority. And, as later events would prove, that authority could vanish far more quickly than anyone expected. For centuries, the wizarding world believed that Dementors were almost impossible to resist. Their ability to drain happiness and overwhelm the human mind seemed to make them immune to most forms of magical defense. Ordinary protective spells offered little help. Even powerful witches and wizards could find themselves collapsing under the weight of despair when the creatures drew near. Yet despite this frightening reputation, there exists one spell capable of driving them away. This spell is known as the Patronus Charm. Among defensive magic, the Patronus is considered one of the most advanced spells a wizard can perform. It requires not only skill with a wand, but a level of emotional focus that many people struggle to achieve. Unlike curses or combat spells, which rely on force and precision, the Patronus draws its strength from something far less tangible. It is powered by happiness. To produce a Patronus, a witch or wizard must concentrate on a memory filled with genuine joy. The memory must be strong enough to overcome the despair created by the Dementor's presence. This is not an easy task. When a Dementor approaches, the creature begins draining positive emotions almost immediately. Happy thoughts become distant and difficult to grasp, fading like light disappearing behind clouds. For someone attempting the Patronus charm, this emotional pressure can be overwhelming. The wizard must hold on to the memory with complete focus, refusing to let it slip away even as the Dementor feeds on the surrounding atmosphere. When the spell is cast successfully, the result is remarkable. A bright, silvery shape bursts from the tip of the wand, taking the form of a glowing animal. This creature, known as a Patronus, acts as a shield against the Dementor. Unlike ordinary light, the Patronus carries the emotional energy of the happy memory used to create it. The creature spreads warmth and confidence into the surrounding air, pushing back the despair that the Dementor relies upon. To the Dementor, this energy is deeply unpleasant. The creatures recoil from the Patronus as if it were a physical force. When a strong Patronus appears, Dementors often retreat quickly, gliding away from the source of light and happiness. In many cases, a single powerful Patronus can drive several Dementors away at once. However, producing such a Patronus is extremely difficult. Many witches and wizards can manage only a weak version of the spell, known as a non-corporeal Patronus. This form appears as a mist of silver light, rather than a fully shaped animal. While still capable of repelling Dementors for a short time, it lacks the strength and stability of a true Patronus. A fully formed Patronus requires exceptional concentration and emotional strength. The caster must be able to summon a memory of pure happiness, even while surrounded by the oppressive influence of the Dementor. For most people, this level of control takes years of practice to achieve. Because of this difficulty, the Patronus charm has traditionally been taught only to advanced students or experienced witches and wizards. Auras, who often face dangerous dark magic, receive special training in the spell as part of their preparation for duty. Their ability to produce Patronuses allows them to defend themselves and others when confronting Dementors. Even among auras, however, the spell remains challenging. Each Patronus takes a unique form that reflects something about the personality or character of the person casting it. Some appear as swift animals, like deer or wolves. Others take the shape of birds, horses, or other creatures associated with strength or freedom. Once a wizard masters the spell, the Patronus often becomes a personal magical signature. The emotional foundation of the charm is what makes it so effective against Dementors. Since the creatures feed on despair, the concentrated happiness within a Patronus creates an environment they cannot tolerate. The light surrounding the magical animal represents the opposite of everything that sustains the Dementor. In many ways, the Patronus acts as a reminder of something the creatures cannot understand. Hope. Where a Dementor spreads darkness and cold, the Patronus restores warmth and clarity. The memories used to summon it remind the caster of moments worth protecting. For prisoners trapped in Azkaban or individuals confronted by Dementors elsewhere, that reminder can mean the difference between surrendering to despair and resisting it. Yet despite its power, the Patronus charm is not a permanent solution to the threat posed by Dementors. The spell must be actively maintained by the caster. If the wizard loses concentration or allows the happy memory to fade, the Patronus weakens and eventually disappears. In situations where many Dementors are present, even a skilled wizard may struggle to sustain the charm for long periods. This limitation explains why the wizarding world has never relied solely on Patronuses to control the creatures of Azkaban. Guarding an entire fortress filled with Dementors would require dozens of powerful Patronuses operating continuously. Such a task would be exhausting even for highly trained witches and wizards. Instead, the Patronus charm serves as a defensive measure rather than a permanent barrier. It allows individuals to protect themselves long enough to escape or drive the creatures away temporarily. Over time, the spell has become one of the most respected pieces of defensive magic known to wizardkind. Mastering it requires courage, emotional resilience, and a deep connection to one's happiest memories. Those who succeed gain a powerful tool against one of the darkest forces in the magical world. And in a strange way, the Patronus represents something larger than the spell itself. It shows that even in the presence of creatures that feed on despair, the wizarding world still possesses the ability to create light. From the moment the Ministry of Magic decided to rely on Dementors as the guards of Azkaban, the creatures became more than a threat lurking in the shadows of wizarding society. They became part of the political structure that governed magical Britain. The decision to use them had solved one problem by containing the creatures on a remote island, but it had also created a new and complicated relationship between the ministry and beings that could never truly be controlled. At first, the arrangement appeared stable. The Dementors remained on the island fortress and rarely ventured beyond its boundaries. Prisoners continued to be transported there after their trials, and the reputation of Azkaban as the most secure prison in the wizarding world quickly became established. From a practical standpoint, the system worked. Escapes were almost non-existent, and even the most dangerous dark wizards seemed powerless against the despair created by the creatures guarding the prison. Because of this success, many ministry officials came to see the Dementors as an unpleasant but necessary part of maintaining order. The creatures required no salary, asked no questions, and felt no sympathy toward the criminals placed within their reach. As long as prisoners were delivered to Azkaban, the Dementors remained where the ministry wanted them. Yet, Beneath this practical convenience lay a deeper problem. Dementors were not employees of the ministry. They had not been recruited, trained, or sworn into service in any ordinary sense. The creatures followed the ministry's instructions only because those instructions happened to align with their own instincts. Azkaban provided them with a steady supply of despair, and so they remained there willingly. This fragile balance created constant tension within the ministry's leadership. Some officials believed the arrangement was dangerous from the very beginning. They argued that the wizarding government had effectively built its prison system on the cooperation of creatures that could not be reasoned with. If the Dementors ever chose to ignore the ministry's authority, there would be very little anyone could do to stop them. Others dismissed these concerns as unnecessary fear. As long as the creatures remained confined to the island and continued feeding on prisoners, they saw no reason to disrupt the system. From their perspective, Azkaban represented one of the most successful security measures the ministry had ever created. Public opinion among ordinary witches and wizards reflected this division. Most people feared the Dementors deeply, but they also believed that those creatures belonged far away on the island prison. The knowledge that Azkaban existed created a sense of safety for many families. Criminals who practiced dark magic would be taken there and locked away where they could cause no further harm. In this way, the Dementors became part of the wizarding world's understanding of justice. Parents warned their children that breaking magical law could lead to a life inside Azkaban. Newspapers occasionally reported when notorious criminals were captured and sent to the prison, reinforcing the idea that the ministry possessed the power to contain even the darkest threats. Yet the system also raised serious moral questions. Not every prisoner sent to Azkaban had committed the same level of crime. Some individuals were responsible for terrible acts involving dark magic and violence. Others had broken magical law in less destructive ways. Regardless of the offense, the conditions inside the prison were largely the same. Every inmate faced the constant presence of Dementors. Critics of the system argued that allowing such creatures to feed on prisoners amounted to a form of cruelty that went beyond simple punishment. The wizarding world had long prided itself on maintaining a civilized society separate from the chaos of uncontrolled magic. Depending on creatures that thrived on despair seemed to contradict those values. Debates about the ethics of Azkaban surfaced periodically within the ministry. Some officials proposed replacing the Dementors with human guards supported by stronger magical defenses. Others suggested creating smaller prisons that would isolate dangerous criminals without exposing them to the creature's influence. Each proposal faced the same problem. No alternative system offered the same level of security. The Dementors' ability to weaken the minds of prisoners made escape extremely difficult. Removing them from the prison would require entirely new methods of containment, and many officials worried that such changes could create opportunities for dangerous criminals to break free. As a result, the ministry continued to rely on the creatures, despite the controversy surrounding them. This uneasy dependence shaped the politics of the wizarding world for generations. Ministers for magic inherited the responsibility of maintaining the delicate balance between controlling the Dementors and benefiting from their presence. Some leaders approached the situation cautiously, while others simply accepted it as an unavoidable part of governing magical society. The arrangement remained stable for many years, but it was never entirely comfortable. Every official who visited Azkaban could feel the unsettling truth beneath the system. The prison functioned not because the ministry truly controlled the Dementors, but because the creatures currently had no reason to rebel against the arrangement. If that reason ever appeared, the situation could change very quickly. This possibility remained distant for a long time, overshadowed by the routine operation of the prison and the steady capture of criminals. Yet as darker forces began to rise again in the wizarding world, the question of the Dementors' loyalty would slowly become more important, because creatures that feed on despair will always be drawn toward the greatest source of darkness. And eventually, someone would appear who understood exactly how to use that fact. As the years passed, and Azkaban became firmly established as the wizarding world's most feared prison. Stories about the fortress began to spread throughout magical Britain. Many witches and wizards never saw the island themselves, yet the reputation of the place grew steadily through rumors, ministry reports, and the rare testimony of those who had entered its walls and lived to leave again. These stories shaped how the wizarding world understood the prison. Some of the earliest prisoners sent to Azkaban were dark wizards who had terrorized communities with powerful curses and dangerous magical experiments. Before the prison existed, containing individuals with that level of magical ability had proven extremely difficult. Azkaban offered a solution that seemed almost absolute. Once inside the fortress, surrounded by the cold sea and the presence of Dementors, even the most capable wizard found it nearly impossible to resist the weight of despair. Many of these early prisoners arrived defiant. Some had spent years practicing dark magic and believed their abilities would allow them to survive anything the ministry attempted. They entered the prison with threats and promises of revenge, convinced that their magical skill would eventually provide an escape. The Dementors quickly proved otherwise. Within weeks, many prisoners showed signs of emotional exhaustion. The cold, the silence, and the relentless resurfacing of painful memories drained their determination. Prisoners who had once spoken loudly about their plans to return to power became quiet and withdrawn. This transformation was not always immediate, but it was consistent. As months passed inside the fortress, the influence of the Dementors slowly reshaped the mental state of nearly everyone confined there. The strongest individuals sometimes resisted longer than others, but even they could not escape the creature's presence entirely. Ministry officials who studied the prison began to notice a pattern among long-term inmates. The longer a prisoner remained inside Azkaban, the less connected they seemed to the outside world. Conversations became shorter and less frequent. Some prisoners struggled to remember events from their own lives before imprisonment. It was as though the prison itself was erasing pieces of their identity. These observations reinforced the growing legend of Azkaban as a place that destroyed the human spirit. Even people who had never committed a crime felt uneasy when the subject of the prison came up in conversation. The idea of spending years surrounded by Dementors was enough to unsettle almost anyone. Over time, certain prisoners became widely known throughout the wizarding world simply because of their association with the fortress. Some were infamous dark wizards whose crimes had attracted public attention long before their capture. Others gained notoriety because of the length of time they survived within the prison's walls. The survival of any prisoner in Azkaban required a kind of quiet endurance. Those who managed to hold on to fragments of hope often relied on memories of loved ones or moments of happiness from their past. These memories acted as small shields against the influence of the Dementors, though maintaining them became harder with each passing year. Occasionally, prisoners who had served long sentences were eventually released back into wizarding society. Their return provided rare glimpses into what life inside the fortress was truly like. Many of these former inmates described the same experience. Time inside Azkaban felt strangely distorted. Days blended together, and the passage of months became difficult to track. Without sunlight or ordinary activity to mark the passing hours, prisoners often lost their sense of how long they had been confined. Some reported that the most painful part of their imprisonment was not the physical conditions of the cells, but the memories forced upon them by the Dementors. Moments of loss or regret would repeat endlessly, making it impossible to think about anything else. Even years after leaving the prison, some former inmates struggled to forget the feeling of those memories returning again and again. These accounts strengthened the prison's reputation as a place of unimaginable suffering. Yet, alongside the stories of despair, a different kind of legend began to develop. Certain prisoners became known for their unusual resilience. A few individuals seemed capable of resisting the effects of the Dementors longer than anyone expected. These rare cases fascinated ministry researchers. How could some prisoners endure the creature's presence for years without losing themselves completely? What allowed them to preserve their sense of identity when so many others faded into silence? Various explanations were proposed. Some officials believed that strong emotional attachments could provide protection against the Dementors' influence. A prisoner who remained focused on thoughts of family or unfinished goals might resist despair more effectively than someone who had already lost hope. Others suggested that certain personalities simply possessed greater mental resilience. Determination, stubbornness, and even anger might provide temporary barriers against the creature's draining presence. Whatever the reason, the existence of such prisoners became part of Azkaban's growing mythology. Stories circulated about individuals who had spent decades inside the fortress without surrendering entirely to despair. These stories did not erase the horror associated with the prison, but they added another layer to its legend. Azkaban was not only a place of punishment, it was also a place where the strength of the human mind was tested against one of the darkest forces in the magical world. The prison's reputation continued to grow as more criminals were sent there over the years. Each new inmate added another story to the fortress's long history. Some stories were whispered in fear, others told as warnings to young witches and wizards who might be tempted by dark magic. Through all these accounts, one detail remained constant. Every story about Azkaban eventually returned to the same presence drifting silently through its corridors. The Dementors were always there. They moved through the prison like shadows, feeding on the despair that filled its stone walls. Prisoners came and went, but the creatures remained, silent witnesses to every year of suffering within the fortress. And as the wizarding world moved slowly toward darker times, the prison would soon receive prisoners whose names would become known far beyond the island itself. By the early 20th century, the wizarding world was beginning to experience a new kind of conflict. For generations, Azkaban had quietly served its purpose, receiving criminals who had violated magical law and keeping them confined behind its cold stone walls. The presence of Dementors ensured that the prison remained secure, and most witches and wizards rarely thought about the island unless a particularly notorious criminal was sent there. That sense of distance began to change as tensions in the wider magical world slowly increased. Across Europe, a powerful dark wizard named Gellert Grindelwald was rising to prominence. Unlike many dark wizards before him, Grindelwald did not operate entirely in secret. His ideas about magical superiority and his belief that wizards should rule openly over muggles attracted followers who were eager to reshape the wizarding world. Although Grindelwald's primary operations took place outside Britain, his influence reached far beyond the borders of any single country. News of his growing movement spread through magical newspapers and whispered conversations in wizarding communities. The possibility of large-scale magical conflict began to feel more real than it had in generations. As Grindelwald's power expanded, the number of arrests connected to dark magic also began to rise. Some of these arrests involved witches and wizards who had openly supported Grindelwald's ideology. Others were criminals who had taken advantage of the growing chaos to practice dangerous forms of magic. In Britain, many of those individuals eventually found themselves transported across the cold waters of the North Sea to Azkaban. For the first time since the prison's creation, the fortress began receiving prisoners connected to a larger international movement, rather than isolated crimes. These prisoners often arrived with strong political convictions. Many believed that Grindelwald's vision represented the future of the wizarding world. Even after their capture, some continued to defend his ideas openly, arguing that magical society needed radical change. Inside the walls of Azkaban, however, the influence of the Dementors treated all prisoners the same. The creatures did not care about ideology or loyalty. Whether a prisoner had acted alone or as part of a larger movement meant nothing to them. Each new arrival simply brought another mind filled with memories and emotions for the Dementors to consume. Still, the growing conflict outside the prison slowly changed the atmosphere within it. Ministry officials, responsible for transporting prisoners to the island, noticed that many of the new inmates displayed a level of determination rarely seen in earlier years. Some believed deeply in Grindelwald's cause and considered their imprisonment a temporary setback rather than a final defeat. At first, this defiance seemed to challenge the usual pattern of Azkaban's influence. Yet the Dementors remained patient. Weeks turned into months, and the familiar effects of the prison gradually began to appear. Even the most committed followers of dark ideology struggled to maintain their confidence under the creature's constant presence. The cold, the silence, and the endless resurfacing of painful memories slowly eroded their determination. For many prisoners, the fortress eventually reduced political conviction to something far quieter. The rise of Grindelwald also brought increased attention to Azkaban itself. With more arrests taking place across Europe, the wizarding world began to discuss prisons and punishment more openly. Some magical governments considered building facilities similar to Azkaban in their own countries, though few possessed the same unusual advantage of having Dementors already gathered in one place. In Britain, the ministry continued to rely on the prison as it always had. Each new prisoner connected to dark magical movements reinforced the belief that Azkaban served a necessary role. Dangerous individuals could be removed from society and contained in a place where their influence would fade. Yet there were also quiet concerns among certain officials. The growing number of prisoners meant a growing concentration of despair inside the fortress. The Dementors feeding on that despair continued to multiply within the prison's walls. Their silent presence filled more corridors and towers than ever before. Some observers wondered whether the creatures might eventually become too numerous to control. For the time being, those concerns remained theoretical. The ministry maintained its authority over the prison, and the Dementors continued to follow the established pattern of guarding the fortress and feeding on the emotions of its inmates. Meanwhile, the conflict surrounding Grindelwald eventually reached its dramatic conclusion when the Dark Wizard was defeated by Albus Dumbledore. His capture marked the end of one of the most dangerous periods in modern wizarding history. Yet the effects of that conflict did not disappear overnight. The wizarding world had learned that large movements built around dark magic could emerge and spread quickly. Ideology could unite followers across different countries, creating threats far greater than any single criminal acting alone. As Azkaban returned to its usual routine of holding prisoners, the fortress carried the quiet memory of that lesson. The Dementors still drifted through its corridors, unchanged by the political struggles that had passed through its walls. They continued feeding on the despair of prisoners, indifferent to the rise and fall of dark wizards. But beyond the cold sea surrounding the island, another generation of witches and wizards was growing up. Among them would eventually be a boy who would reshape the wizarding world in ways no one could yet imagine. And when that time came, the prison of Azkaban and the creatures guarding it would once again become deeply connected to the fate of magical Britain. For many years after the defeat of Grindelwald, the wizarding world experienced a period that felt comparatively calm. Azkaban continued to operate in its familiar rhythm. Prisoners arrived after their trials, Dementors drifted through the dark corridors of the fortress, and the Ministry of Magic maintained the belief that the prison remained the most secure place to contain those who threatened magical society. Yet beneath this quiet surface, a new darkness was beginning to grow. In Britain, a young wizard named Tom Riddle had once attended Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. During his time at the school, he was known for his intelligence, ambition, and unusual talent for magic. Many of his teachers saw him as a promising student, with a brilliant future ahead of him. Very few understood the path he would eventually choose. As the years passed, Tom Riddle began to transform himself into something far more dangerous. He abandoned his original name and adopted a new identity, one designed to inspire fear. From that point forward, he would be known as Lord Voldemort. Around him gathered a group of followers who believed in his vision of a wizarding world ruled by those he considered pure-blooded magical families. These followers became known as Death Eaters. Unlike many dark wizards before him, Voldemort did not operate alone. His movement spread quietly through wizarding communities, recruiting individuals who shared his beliefs or who were simply drawn to his growing power. Some were motivated by ideology, while others were persuaded through intimidation and promises of influence. As Voldemort's influence expanded, the wizarding world entered what would later be called the First Wizarding War. During this time, fear spread rapidly through magical Britain. The Death Eaters carried out attacks against those who opposed them, including witches and wizards who refused to support Voldemort's cause. Many families lived in constant anxiety, unsure which neighbors might secretly support the Dark Movement. The Ministry of Magic struggled to respond to the growing crisis. Auras were deployed to capture known Death Eaters, but the organization of Voldemort's followers made this task extremely difficult. Some members operated openly, while others remained hidden within ordinary wizarding society. The uncertainty about who could be trusted created an atmosphere of suspicion that affected nearly everyone. As the conflict intensified, the number of arrests began to rise. Captured Death Eaters were brought before the Ministry for trial, and many of them were sentenced to imprisonment in Azkaban. The fortress that had once held isolated criminals now began receiving individuals connected to a much larger and more organized threat. The arrival of these prisoners changed the atmosphere inside the prison. Unlike many earlier inmates, the captured Death Eaters often arrived with unwavering loyalty to Voldemort. They believed their leader would eventually triumph over the Ministry and free them from imprisonment. Some openly declared that Azkaban would not hold them forever. For a short time, their confidence seemed strong. Yet the Dementors guarding the prison treated them no differently than any other prisoner. As the creatures drifted through the fortress corridors, the familiar cycle of despair began to take hold. The cold air settled over the stone cells, and the relentless resurfacing of painful memories slowly weakened the prisoners' resolve. Even those who believed deeply in Voldemort's cause found their determination fading under the constant influence of the creatures. Still, the presence of Death Eaters inside Azkaban created a new kind of tension within the prison. These prisoners were not merely criminals seeking personal gain. They were members of a larger movement whose leader remained free. Outside the prison walls, Voldemort continued to gather power, and every new attack by his followers reminded the Ministry that the conflict was far from over. For the Dementors themselves, the growing war created an environment rich with despair. The fear spreading through wizarding society, combined with the misery of prisoners confined in Azkaban, provided an abundance of emotional energy for the creatures to feed upon. Their numbers within the fortress continued to grow as the prison population increased. Ministry officials responsible for overseeing Azkaban noticed this change but struggled to determine its significance. On one hand, the presence of more Dementors made the prison even more secure. Any prisoner attempting to resist the creatures would face an overwhelming concentration of despair. On the other hand, the growing number of Dementors raised quiet concerns about the Ministry's ability to maintain control over them. For the moment, those concerns remained secondary to the urgent task of fighting Voldemort's rising power. Across magical Britain, the conflict deepened. Families disappeared, attacks occurred without warning, and entire communities lived under the shadow of fear. Some witches and wizards joined the Ministry's efforts to resist Voldemort, while others quietly aligned themselves with his cause. Amid this chaos, Azkaban stood as a grim symbol of the struggle. Every time a Death Eater was captured and transported across the cold sea, the wizarding world was reminded that the Ministry was still capable of striking back. Yet each new prisoner also represented another piece of a war that showed no clear sign of ending. Inside the fortress, the Dementors continued their silent patrols, feeding on the despair of prisoners and drifting through the dark corridors like shadows. They did not care about the reasons behind the conflict. They felt no loyalty to either side. All that mattered to them was the growing atmosphere of misery surrounding the war. And as that misery deepened, the creatures guarding Azkaban grew stronger than ever. Among all the prisoners who were eventually sent to Azkaban during the years surrounding the First Wizarding War, few names would later become as famous as Sirius Black. His story would eventually transform how the wizarding world understood both the prison and the creatures that guarded it. Before his imprisonment, Sirius Black had been known as a member of an ancient pure-blood wizarding family. The Black family carried a long tradition of strong beliefs about magical superiority, and many of its members openly supported the ideals that Voldemort later promoted. Sirius, however, had rejected those views while still young. During his years at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Sirius became close friends with James Potter, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. The four of them formed a bond that lasted well beyond their school days. When the First Wizarding War began, Sirius and James joined the group of witches and wizards who opposed Voldemort. This resistance movement would eventually become known as the Order of the Phoenix. For several years, Sirius fought alongside his friends against Voldemort's followers. He was known for his courage and his willingness to confront danger directly. Yet the war was filled with uncertainty and betrayal, and by the time it reached its final stages, very few people knew who could truly be trusted. When James and Lily Potter were murdered by Voldemort, the wizarding world was thrown into shock. Voldemort himself vanished that same night after attempting to kill their infant son, Harry. In the confusion that followed, attention quickly turned toward the question of who had betrayed the Potters' hiding place. Suspicion soon fell upon Sirius Black. The official story that spread through Wizarding Britain was both shocking and tragic. Sirius was believed to have betrayed the Potters by revealing their location to Voldemort. Soon after their deaths, he confronted Peter Pettigrew on a crowded street. According to the evidence available at the time, that confrontation ended with an enormous magical explosion that killed several Muggles, along with Pettigrew himself. When Ministry officials arrived at the scene, they found Sirius Black standing among the wreckage, laughing uncontrollably. The destruction and the apparent murder of Pettigrew convinced the authorities that Sirius was responsible for both the betrayal of the Potters and the deadly attack in the street. He was arrested immediately. The wizarding world reacted with horror to the news. A man who had once been seen as a close friend of the Potters was now believed to have played a role in their deaths. For many people, Sirius became one of the most hated criminals of the war. Without a full public trial, he was sent directly to Azkaban. When Sirius arrived at the fortress, the prison was already filled with prisoners connected to Voldemort's movement. Many Death Eaters had been captured and confined within the stone cells. The presence of these prisoners created an atmosphere of deep despair throughout the prison. For the Dementors guarding Azkaban, Sirius was simply another new arrival. Yet Sirius would eventually become something very different from the other inmates. His imprisonment would lead to an event that had never occurred before in the history of the fortress. He would escape. At first, however, Sirius seemed to follow the same pattern as other prisoners. He was placed inside a cell within the cold stone walls of the prison, surrounded by the drifting presence of Dementors. The creatures continued their silent patrols through the corridors, feeding on the despair of the prisoners they guarded. But Sirius possessed one unusual advantage that the Dementors could not fully exploit. He was an animagus. An animagus is a wizard capable of transforming into an animal at will. Sirius had learned this rare and difficult skill during his years at Hogwarts, though the ability was never officially registered with the Ministry. When he transformed, Sirius took the shape of a large black dog. This ability would eventually become the key to his survival. The Dementors sensed human emotions rather than physical forms. Their power relied on detecting despair, fear, and other strong feelings that existed within the human mind. When Sirius transformed into a dog, his emotions became far simpler and less intense. The despair inside his mind did not disappear entirely, but it changed shape. As a dog, he experienced the world through instinct rather than complex thought. This made it harder for the Dementors to sense him clearly. Their influence still affected him, but not with the same crushing intensity that other prisoners experienced. Over time, Sirius began to realize something important. The Dementors could weaken him, but they could not completely break him. One thought in particular remained strong enough to survive the creature's influence. Sirius knew that he had not betrayed the Potters. He knew that the true traitor had been Peter Pettigrew, who had secretly been working for Voldemort all along. That knowledge kept a small piece of determination alive within him. Years passed inside the prison, and Sirius slowly began forming a plan. The idea was simple, but incredibly dangerous. If he could transform into his dog form and slip past the Dementors, he might be able to escape the fortress. The creatures rarely paid attention to animals. Their focus remained fixed on the emotions of human prisoners. When the moment finally came, Sirius took the risk. He transformed into his dog form and managed to slip through the prison's defenses. The exact details of how he reached the outer areas of the fortress remain unclear, but eventually, he made his way beyond the main structure and reached the waters surrounding the island. From there he swam. The sea around Azkaban was freezing and violent, yet Sirius managed to survive the journey by remaining in his animal form. A dog's body could endure the cold far longer than a human's, and the instinctive determination to keep moving carried him through the waves. When he finally reached the mainland, Sirius Black became the first prisoner in the history of Azkaban to escape from the fortress. The news shocked the entire wizarding world. For generations, the prison had been considered completely secure. The presence of the Dementors was believed to make escape impossible. Yet somehow, one prisoner had managed to slip past the creatures and vanish into the outside world. The Ministry of Magic reacted with immediate alarm. If Sirius Black had truly escaped, it meant that the most secure prison in magical Britain had a weakness, and no one knew where he had gone. The escape of Sirius Black sent a wave of shock through the Ministry of Magic, unlike anything it had experienced in decades. For generations, Azkaban had been considered completely secure. The fortress, surrounded by cold waters and guarded by Dementors, had held some of the most dangerous witches and wizards in history without a single successful escape. The idea that someone had managed to leave the island alive seemed almost impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. When ministry officials inspected the prison after Sirius vanished, they confirmed that one of the cells was empty. The Dementors that patrolled the corridors had not raised any warning before his disappearance. To them, the absence of one prisoner had gone unnoticed until long after he was gone. This realization frightened the ministry deeply. The prison had been built around the assumption that Dementors could sense and suppress the minds of prisoners before any escape attempt could take place. If Sirius Black had managed to bypass that system, it meant that the security of Azkaban might not be as absolute as everyone believed. Even worse was the identity of the escaped prisoner. According to the official story, accepted by the wizarding world, Sirius Black had betrayed James and Lily Potter to Lord Voldemort. He was believed to have helped orchestrate the events that led to their deaths and had later murdered Peter Pettigrew along with several muggles in the explosion that destroyed part of a city street. These crimes made him one of the most infamous figures associated with the First Wizarding War. Now that man was free. Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, and his advisors immediately began discussing the possible consequences. If Sirius truly remained loyal to Voldemort's cause, his escape could signal the beginning of new violence. The wizarding world had only recently begun recovering from years of war, and the thought of another powerful dark wizard returning to action caused widespread fear. The ministry's first response was to increase security around Azkaban. Additional inspections were carried out to ensure that no other prisoners had escaped during the confusion. Auras were sent to examine the prison's magical defenses and determine whether new protections should be added. Although the fortress itself remained secure, the fact that Sirius had already escaped meant that preventing further escapes could not solve the immediate problem. The greater concern was finding him. Ministry officials began organizing a large-scale search across magical Britain. Auras were dispatched to investigate possible hiding places and track any signs of the escaped prisoner. Magical transportation networks were monitored, and warnings were sent to wizarding communities across the country. At the same time, the ministry faced another complication. Sirius Black was believed to be specifically interested in one particular target, Harry Potter. Because Sirius had once been close friends with James Potter, Many officials feared that his escape might be connected to the surviving child of the family he had supposedly betrayed. Some believed he might attempt to complete Voldemort's unfinished work by killing Harry himself. This possibility made the situation even more urgent. Harry was still a student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, a place normally considered one of the safest locations in the wizarding world. Yet the Ministry could not ignore the risk that Sirius might attempt to approach the school. Cornelius Fudge began working closely with Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, to determine how best to protect the students. Dumbledore remained calm during these discussions, though those who knew him well could see that he took the threat seriously. The Ministry soon decided on a drastic measure. Dementors would be sent to guard the area around Hogwarts. This decision was controversial from the beginning. Hogwarts had always been a place of learning and safety for young witches and wizards. Introducing creatures that fed on despair into the vicinity of the school seemed like a dangerous idea. Dumbledore himself strongly objected. He argued that Dementors were unpredictable and unsuitable for a place filled with children. Their presence could create fear among the students and potentially cause harm even without direct attacks. In his view, the creatures were better confined to Azkaban, where their influence was limited to prisoners. The Ministry, however, insisted that the threat posed by Sirius Black justified extraordinary precautions. Their reasoning was simple. If Dementors could detect human emotions and track individuals through the despair within their minds, they might be able to locate Sirius more effectively than ordinary auras. By stationing the creatures around Hogwarts and other key locations, the Ministry hoped to prevent him from approaching Harry Potter. Reluctantly, the decision moved forward. Soon after the start of the new school year, Dementors began appearing near the Hogwarts grounds. They positioned themselves at various points around the castle, forming a silent perimeter that extended across the surrounding landscape. The sight of these hooded figures drifting through the mist unsettled everyone who lived or studied at the school. Students who had only heard stories about Dementors now found themselves living under the shadow of those creatures every day. The cold that accompanied them spread across the nearby hills and forests, and even approaching the castle gates meant passing within sight of their tattered robes. For the Ministry, the presence of the Dementors represented security. For the students of Hogwarts, it represented something far more troubling. The creatures that had once existed only in distant stories about Azkaban were now standing just beyond the walls of their school. And as the search for Sirius Black continued across magical Britain, no one could say exactly how long those silent guards would remain. The decision to station Dementors around Hogwarts marked one of the most unusual moments in the history of the school. For centuries, the castle had stood as a place where young witches and wizards could study magic in relative safety, far removed from many of the dangers that existed in the outside world. Powerful protective enchantments surrounded the grounds, and the presence of experienced professors ensured that most threats could be handled quickly. The arrival of Dementors changed that atmosphere immediately. When the creatures first appeared along the edges of the school's territory, many students did not understand what they were seeing. From a distance, the figures looked like tall shadows drifting slowly through the mist that often gathered around the hills near the castle. Their long robes moved gently in the wind, and the air around them seemed darker than the surrounding landscape. It did not take long for rumors to spread through the school. Students began whispering that the Ministry had sent the creatures to capture Sirius Black if he attempted to approach Hogwarts. The idea that a dangerous criminal might be searching for the castle was unsettling enough. The knowledge that Dementors were now standing guard made the situation feel far more frightening. Even before any direct encounter occurred, the presence of the creatures began to affect life at the school. Whenever students traveled toward the gates or walked along the outer grounds, they could sometimes see the distant shapes of Dementors gliding along the perimeter. The cold that followed them occasionally drifted across the landscape, creating sudden moments when the air felt unusually heavy and silent. Many students tried to avoid looking toward the creatures at all. Inside the castle, the professors also felt the change in atmosphere. The presence of Dementors so close to Hogwarts created an unusual tension among the staff. Some believed the ministry's decision had been reckless, placing dangerous entities near a school filled with children. Albus Dumbledore remained firm in his objections. Although he could not override the ministry's authority in the matter, he made it clear that the Dementors would not be allowed to enter the castle itself. The creatures were instructed to remain outside the grounds and to avoid approaching students unless absolutely necessary. The Dementors appeared to follow these instructions, though their obedience seemed more like quiet tolerance than genuine cooperation. They drifted through the mist, along the edges of the forest and the hills beyond the lake, waiting patiently for any sign of the escaped prisoner. Their silent patrols continued day and night, unaffected by weather or time. For the students of Hogwarts, however, their presence was impossible to ignore. Some students reacted with curiosity, watching the distant figures from castle windows and discussing the creatures during meals in the Great Hall. Others felt a deep sense of unease whenever they caught sight of the dark shapes moving across the landscape. Younger students were especially frightened by the stories they heard. Older pupils described the creatures as soul-stealing monsters from Azkaban, capable of draining happiness from anyone who stood too close. Even those who tried to dismiss the rumors found themselves glancing nervously toward the castle gates whenever they left the building. The emotional impact of the Dementors extended beyond simple fear. On certain days when the creatures drifted closer to the school's boundaries, students reported feeling strangely tired or distracted during their lessons. The warmth of the castle remained intact, yet a faint sense of gloom sometimes crept into the classrooms. These effects were subtle but noticeable. Some students found it harder to concentrate on their studies. Others experienced sudden waves of sadness without understanding why. Although the creatures never crossed into the castle itself, their influence seemed capable of reaching further than anyone expected. The professors monitored the situation carefully. Remus Lupin, who had recently joined the Hogwarts staff as the defense against the dark arts teacher, appeared particularly aware of the danger posed by the Dementors. Having studied dark creatures extensively, he understood how powerful their influence could become. Lupin quietly prepared himself to help the students if the creatures ever approached too closely. Meanwhile, the Ministry continued its search for Sirius Black across the wizarding world. Aurors followed every possible lead, hoping to capture the escaped prisoner before he could reach Hogwarts or any other vulnerable location. Despite these efforts, no clear sign of Sirius appeared. Weeks passed with no confirmed sightings. The Dementors continued their silent patrols, drifting along the hills and forests surrounding the castle. Their presence remained constant, like dark sentinels, waiting for a signal only they could sense. Life at Hogwarts slowly adjusted to this strange new reality. Students attended classes, played Quidditch, and moved through the castle as they always had. Yet the shadow of the Dementors lingered just beyond the walls. The creatures stood as a reminder that the wizarding world outside the school was still filled with danger. And as the search for Sirius Black continued, the silent guards surrounding Hogwarts would soon come far closer to the students than anyone had expected. The first time Harry Potter encountered a Dementor did not take place at Hogwarts itself, but during the journey that would carry him there. The Hogwarts Express had always been a place of excitement for students returning to school after the summer holidays. Compartments filled with conversation, laughter, and the rustling of sweet wrappers created an atmosphere that felt warm and familiar to those traveling north toward the castle. On that particular journey, however, the mood of the train began to change long before anyone understood why. The train had already been moving through the countryside for several hours when it suddenly slowed. Students glanced through the windows, expecting to see a station or some kind of obstruction on the tracks. Instead, they saw only darkness outside. As the evening sky settled over the landscape, the train came to a complete stop. Inside the compartments, conversations faded into confusion. Some students leaned into the corridor to ask what was happening. Others pressed their faces against the windows, hoping to see someone outside explaining the delay. Yet the tracks remained empty. Then the lights began to flicker. The lamps overhead dimmed suddenly, casting the corridor into shadow. A cold draft moved through the train as though someone had opened a door to winter itself. Students who had been laughing moments earlier fell silent, their breath visible in the sudden chill. An uneasy stillness spread through the train. It was at this moment that the door to one of the compartments slid open. Standing in the doorway was a tall, hooded figure wrapped in tattered black robes. The creature seemed to float rather than step forward, its long sleeves hanging motionless as it entered the compartment. For a moment, no one spoke. The air inside the compartment grew colder. With every second, the figure remained there. A heavy silence settled over the students, pressing down on them in a way that felt almost physical. Even those who did not fully understand what they were seeing could feel that something was terribly wrong. Harry felt the change more strongly than anyone else. As the Dementor moved closer, the cold surrounding it seemed to reach directly into his mind. The warmth of the train vanished completely. Instead, a deep wave of despair rose within him, stronger than anything he had ever experienced before. Suddenly, he heard something. At first, the sound seemed distant, like an echo carried across time. Then it grew clearer. A woman's voice cried out in fear, followed by a harsh voice shouting words Harry could not fully understand. The voices became louder, more desperate. Harry felt as if he were no longer sitting inside the train compartment at all. The sound of the screaming woman filled his mind, and an overwhelming sense of terror washed over him. The darkness surrounding the Dementor seemed to deepen, pulling him further into the memory. His vision blurred. The last thing Harry remembered before losing consciousness was the cold, hollow presence of the creature leaning toward him. When he opened his eyes again, the train was moving. The lights had returned, and the compartment felt warm once more. Several faces were leaning over him with concern. Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley looked pale and shaken, while another figure stood nearby holding a wand. This figure was Professor Remus Lupin. Lupin had been asleep in the compartment when the Dementor arrived, but he had awakened in time to drive the creature away. With a calm movement, he had produced a spell that forced the Dementor back into the corridor and out of the train entirely. The details of that spell were not immediately clear to the students. What they did notice was the piece of chocolate Lupin handed to Harry once he regained consciousness. Lupin explained that chocolate could help counteract the lingering effects of a Dementor's presence. The sweetness and warmth seemed to restore a small amount of energy that the creature had drained away. As the train continued its journey toward Hogwarts, the students slowly recovered from the encounter. The explanation soon spread through the train. Ministry officials had ordered Dementors to search the Hogwarts Express for Sirius Black. The creatures had boarded the train in hopes of detecting the escaped prisoner among the passengers. For most students, the experience had been frightening but brief. For Harry, however, the encounter had been far more intense. While the others had felt cold and uneasy, Harry had been overwhelmed by the memories forced into his mind by the Dementor's presence. The screaming voice he heard belonged to his mother, Lily Potter, during the final moments before her death at the hands of Voldemort. The creature had drawn that memory to the surface with terrible clarity. Although the Dementor had left the train, the echo of that moment remained with Harry long after the journey ended. As the Hogwarts Express finally arrived at the station, and the students stepped out into the cool night air, Harry carried with him the knowledge that the creatures guarding Azkaban possessed a power unlike any he had faced before. They did not attack with spells or claws. They attacked the mind itself. After the encounter on the Hogwarts Express, it quickly became clear that Harry's reaction to the Dementor had been very different from that of the other students. Many of them had felt uncomfortable during the creature's brief presence on the train. The cold and the sudden wave of unease had frightened them, but once the Dementor left, most were able to recover quickly. Harry, however, had lost consciousness completely. This puzzled many people who heard about the incident. Harry was not known for being easily frightened. In fact, during his previous years at Hogwarts, he had already faced several dangerous magical situations with remarkable courage. Yet the Dementor had affected him more severely than anyone else on the train. The explanation lay in the unique nature of the creatures themselves. Dementors do not simply create fear. They search through the emotions of the people around them and draw out the darkest memories they can find. These memories rise to the surface of the mind with unusual strength, forcing the victim to relive moments of intense pain or loss. For many individuals, those memories might involve failures, arguments, or other difficult experiences. While unpleasant, such memories rarely carry the overwhelming emotional force that can completely paralyze a person. Harry's past was different. When the Dementor approached him on the train, it reached into a memory that few people had ever experienced. Harry had been present, though only as a baby, during the final moments before Voldemort murdered his mother. That event had shaped the entire course of his life. Although Harry could not consciously remember the night of the attack, the emotional imprint of that moment remained buried within his mind. The Dementor's presence forced the memory upward with terrifying clarity. Instead of simply feeling sadness or fear, Harry heard the sound of his mother's voice pleading for his life. The desperation in that voice carried the weight of a moment when everything was lost. For a child who had grown up without parents and without understanding exactly what had happened to them, the memory was overwhelming. The Dementor had uncovered something deeper than ordinary sorrow. It had uncovered the moment that defined Harry's entire existence. Because of this, the creature's influence struck him with unusual force. The despair surrounding that memory was far stronger than anything most students carried within their minds. When the Dementor reached toward that memory, the emotional impact became too powerful for Harry to withstand. This reaction concerned Professor Lupin once he realized what had happened. Lupin understood that Harry's vulnerability to Dementors would likely continue as long as the creatures remained near the school. Unlike other students, Harry carried within him a memory of profound loss that the Dementors could easily exploit. Yet Lupin also believed that Harry could learn to defend himself. The key to resisting Dementors was not physical strength or magical aggression. Their power could only be countered by something far more delicate. A witch or wizard needed the ability to summon a powerful, happy memory strong enough to push back the despair created by the creatures. For someone like Harry, this task was especially difficult. The presence of the Dementors made happy memories harder to recall. As the creatures drained positive emotions from the air, even joyful thoughts could fade quickly under their influence. For a person already burdened by painful memories, the challenge became even greater. Despite this difficulty, Lupin decided that Harry should begin learning the Patronus charm. The spell represented the only reliable defense against Dementors. If Harry could master it, he would gain the ability to repel the creatures and protect himself from their influence. Without that knowledge, every future encounter with a Dementor might end the same way the incident on the train had ended. Harry agreed to the lessons, though he remained uneasy about what the training might require. He knew that practicing the Patronus charm would force him to confront the very memories the Dementors had revealed. Yet he also understood that avoiding those memories would not make the creatures disappear. As the weeks passed at Hogwarts, Harry slowly began to realize that the Dementors had changed something inside him. The encounter on the train had shown him that the past he barely remembered still held enormous power over his mind. The voices he had heard were more than distant echoes. They were fragments of a moment that shaped everything that followed. For the Dementors, those fragments represented a source of despair they could feed upon. For Harry, however, they became a reminder of something else as well. The memory of his mother's voice had been filled with fear, but it had also been filled with love. Even in the final seconds before her death, Lily Potter had tried to protect her son. That realization would eventually give Harry a different kind of strength. The Dementors might be able to draw out the pain within his memories, but they could not erase the meaning behind those memories. Hidden beneath the despair was something far more powerful, and learning how to reach that strength would become the key to resisting the creatures that haunted the edges of Hogwarts. After the incident on the Hogwarts Express, Professor Remus Lupin understood that the presence of Dementors around the school would continue to affect Harry. The creatures had been placed outside the grounds to capture Sirius Black, but their influence did not stop at the castle walls. From time to time, the cold feeling they carried drifted across the lake and through the surrounding hills, reminding everyone that the creatures were still there. For Harry, this meant that learning to defend himself was no longer simply an interesting piece of magical knowledge. It had become necessary. Lupin began teaching Harry the Patronus charm in private lessons during the school year. The spell was known to be one of the most difficult defensive charms a wizard could attempt. Even adult witches and wizards often struggled to produce a full Patronus, and many students never learned the spell at all. Yet Lupin believed Harry had a reason to try. The lessons began in a quiet classroom where Lupin could carefully control the situation. Instead of bringing an actual Dementor into the room, Lupin used a boggart to create a similar effect. A boggart is a magical creature that transforms into whatever its observer fears most. In Harry's case, the boggart would take the shape of a Dementor. When the boggart changed form, the air in the classroom immediately grew colder. The tall, hooded shape appeared exactly as Harry remembered from the train. Even though Lupin had warned him that the creature was only an imitation, the sight of it still filled Harry with unease. Lupin explained that the key to the Patronus charm was concentration. Harry would need to focus on a memory that made him feel genuinely happy. The memory had to be strong enough to push back the despair created by the Dementor's presence. Only then could the spell produce the magical shield necessary to drive the creature away. Harry raised his wand and attempted the spell for the first time. The result was disappointing. Instead of producing the bright silver Patronus Lupin described, only a faint wisp of light emerged from the tip of Harry's wand before fading away. The boggart Dementor continued to drift closer, unaffected by the weak magic. Lupin quickly ended the attempt before the situation could worsen. He explained that failure was common when learning such a difficult spell. The Patronus required more than technical skill. It required emotional clarity, something that could be difficult to achieve when fear and despair were already clouding the mind. Over the following weeks, the lessons continued. Each time Harry tried to summon a Patronus, he focused on different happy memories. Some of these memories involved his friends at Hogwarts. Others involved the rare moments of kindness he had experienced during his childhood. Sometimes, a thin burst of silver light appeared, stronger than before, but still not powerful enough to form the shape of an animal. The magic flickered and vanished before it could repel the boggart. Despite the slow progress, Lupin remained patient. He understood that the spell demanded persistence. Every attempt strengthened Harry's ability to hold on to happiness, even when confronted by the image of a Dementor. Gradually, the silver light produced by Harry's wand grew brighter and more stable, yet the training carried an unexpected side effect. Each time the boggart took the shape of a Dementor, Harry heard the same echoes of his past. The distant sound of his mother's voice returned again and again. At first, these memories distracted him so strongly that they ruined his concentration entirely. Eventually, Harry began to realize something important. The memory that caused him pain also carried a deeper meaning. His mother had sacrificed her life to protect him. The love behind that sacrifice was a powerful emotion, far stronger than the despair the Dementors attempted to create. As Harry began to understand this, his Patronus grew stronger. During one lesson, the silver light that burst from his wand suddenly expanded across the room, driving the boggart backward with surprising force. The creature retreated into the wardrobe where it had been stored, unable to withstand the growing brightness. Although the Patronus had not yet taken a full animal form, Lupin could see that Harry was improving. The training continued throughout the year. Each lesson strengthened Harry's ability to resist the influence of the Dementors waiting beyond the castle walls. While the creatures remained dangerous, Harry was no longer completely helpless against them. More importantly, the Patronus charm taught him something about the nature of the creatures themselves. Dementors fed on despair because despair weakened the mind. But when a wizard focused on a memory of genuine happiness, that darkness lost its power. In the presence of true hope, the creatures had no strength at all. This lesson would soon become more important than either Harry or Lupin realized, because the Dementors guarding Hogwarts would not remain distant forever. Although the Dementors had been ordered to remain outside the castle, their presence around the grounds of Hogwarts quickly became impossible to ignore. The creatures drifted along the edges of the school's territory like silent sentinels, moving slowly through the mist that often gathered near the forest and the hills beyond the lake. From a distance, they looked like dark shapes against the pale sky, their long robes trailing behind them as they glided through the air. Students soon grew accustomed to seeing them. Whenever someone walked toward the gates at the edge of the grounds, the distant figures could sometimes be spotted along the perimeter. The cold that followed them occasionally reached the paths leading up to the castle, bringing with it a strange stillness that made the surrounding landscape feel unnaturally quiet. Even those who tried to ignore the creatures felt their influence from time to time. On certain days, the sky above the school seemed darker than usual, and the wind carried a chill that did not belong to the season. During those moments, the presence of the Dementors felt closer than it actually was. Conversations would grow quieter, and many students found themselves glancing toward the distant hills where the creatures waited. The professors kept watch over the situation carefully. Albus Dumbledore had made it clear that the Dementors were not welcome within the castle itself. They were permitted to patrol the outer areas of the grounds only in their search for Sirius Black. If any creature attempted to approach the students directly, the staff would intervene immediately. Despite this rule, the atmosphere around Hogwarts remained tense. The possibility that Sirius Black might attempt to enter the school kept the Ministry determined to maintain the Dementors' presence. Each time the creatures appeared along the boundaries of the grounds, they served as a reminder that the escaped prisoner was still somewhere in the wizarding world. One of the most noticeable moments when the Dementors came close to the students occurred during a Quidditch match. Quidditch had always been one of the most exciting events at Hogwarts. Students gathered around the stands surrounding the pitch, cheering loudly as the players raced through the air on their brooms. The matches filled the grounds with energy and excitement that could be felt across the entire school. On the day of that particular match, however, the weather was unusually cold. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, and the wind swept through the stadium with enough force to rattle the wooden stands. Despite the unpleasant conditions, the match continued. Players soared above the field, weaving through the rain as they chased the small golden snitch that would determine the outcome. Harry Potter flew high above the pitch, searching for the tiny ball. As he circled the stadium, something unusual began to happen. The air around him suddenly grew colder than before. At first, he assumed it was simply the storm passing overhead, but the temperature continued to drop until the breath in his lungs felt painfully cold. Then he saw them. Several dark shapes were rising slowly from the edge of the field. The hooded figures drifted upward toward the sky, their long robes moving through the rain like shadows spreading across the air. The Dementors had approached the Quidditch pitch. As the creatures floated closer, the familiar wave of despair crashed over Harry's mind. The sounds of the cheering crowd faded away, replaced by the distant echo of a memory he had come to dread. Once again he heard the voice of his mother. The cold surrounding him deepened, and the world around the stadium began to blur. Harry struggled to keep control of his broom, but the strength drained from his body as the Dementors drew nearer. Far below, the spectators watched in confusion as Harry suddenly lost control. His broom tilted sharply, and he began falling toward the ground. Before he could recover, the darkness closed around him, and he lost consciousness once again. His body slipped from the broom and dropped through the rain toward the pitch below. The fall could have been disastrous, but one of the Hogwarts professors reacted quickly. Professor Dumbledore raised his wand and cast a powerful spell that slowed Harry's descent, allowing him to land safely on the ground. At the same time, the Dementors were forced away from the stadium. The match ended abruptly as the professors cleared the field and carried Harry back toward the castle. Students who had watched the fall stood in shocked silence, realizing that the creatures guarding the school had come dangerously close to causing real harm. This incident strengthened Dumbledore's opposition to the Ministry's decision. The presence of Dementors near a school filled with children had always been a risky choice. Now it was clear that even indirect contact with the creatures could have serious consequences. Yet the Ministry remained firm in its decision. Until Sirius Black was captured, the Dementors would continue their patrol around Hogwarts. Their search would not end simply because the creatures made students uncomfortable. And so the hooded figures remained along the edges of the grounds, drifting through the mist and waiting patiently for the escaped prisoner to appear. As the school year continued, the presence of the Dementors around Hogwarts slowly faded into the background of daily life. Students still saw the hooded figures drifting along the edges of the grounds from time to time, but weeks passed without any direct confrontation. The Ministry's search for Sirius Black continued across the wizarding world, yet no one could say exactly where the escaped prisoner had gone. For Harry, however, the threat never felt entirely distant. The creatures had already affected him more strongly than anyone else at the school. Each encounter left him shaken in ways that were difficult to explain, and even the thought of them lingering near the castle brought back the cold feeling that seemed to reach directly into his mind. Late in the school year, events would bring Harry closer to the Dementors than ever before. On a quiet night near the edge of the Hogwarts grounds, Harry found himself near the lake that stretched across the valley below the castle. The water reflected the pale light of the moon, and the surrounding forest stood silent beyond the shore. Nearby stood Sirius Black. For the first time since his escape from Azkaban, the truth about Sirius had finally begun to surface. The story that had been believed throughout the wizarding world was not as simple as everyone had thought. Sirius had not betrayed the Potters after all. The true traitor had been Peter Pettigrew, who had secretly served Voldemort and faked his own death to escape suspicion. Yet before this revelation could fully change the situation, another danger appeared. From the darkness beyond the trees, the Dementors began to gather. At first, there were only a few shapes drifting toward the shore of the lake. Their long robes moved slowly through the air as they approached, drawn by the emotions surrounding the group standing near the water. Then more appeared. The hooded figures emerged from every direction, gliding silently through the night. Their numbers grew rapidly until dozens of Dementors surrounded the lakeside clearing. The air became colder with each passing second. Harry felt the familiar pressure building inside his mind. The despair carried by the creatures pressed down on him with overwhelming force. The warmth of the night vanished completely, replaced by a freezing darkness that seemed to swallow every other sensation. Sirius, already weakened after years inside Azkaban, struggled to remain standing. The Dementors moved closer. Their skeletal hands stretched forward as they drifted toward the two figures near the water. The silence surrounding them deepened until even the sounds of the lake seemed to fade away. Harry knew what was coming. If the creatures reached them, they would perform the Dementor's kiss. Sirius would lose his soul, and Harry might suffer the same fate. The memory of Lupin's lessons flashed through Harry's mind as he realized there was only one way to stop the creatures. He raised his wand. The words of the Patronus charm came to his lips as he tried to summon a happy memory, strong enough to push back the despair surrounding him. Yet, the presence of so many Dementors made concentration nearly impossible. The cold tightened around his mind. Harry attempted the spell once, but the silver light that emerged from his wand was weak and unstable. The Patronus flickered briefly before dissolving into the darkness. The Dementors continued to advance. Another wave of despair crashed over him. The familiar echo of his mother's voice returned, filling his thoughts with the sound of her final moments. The creatures seemed to grow stronger as the memory resurfaced, feeding on the pain within it. Harry fell to his knees beside Sirius. Through the blur of darkness, he saw the Dementors closing in from every direction. Their hooded heads turned toward him, drawn by the emotions rising within his mind. The moment felt hopeless. Then something unexpected happened. Across the lake, a bright silver light suddenly appeared. At first, the light looked distant, like a reflection moving across the water. Then it grew stronger, racing toward the shore with incredible speed. The shape of a glowing animal burst through the darkness, spreading radiant energy across the clearing. It was a Patronus. The silver creature charged directly into the group of Dementors. Wherever the Patronus passed, the creatures recoiled and drifted backward. The light surrounding the animal burned with the strength of powerful magic, pushing the Dementors away from the shore. Within moments, the clearing was filled with silver brilliance. The Dementors retreated rapidly, gliding back into the darkness from which they had emerged. The cold air lifted as the creatures fled from the radiant Patronus that now stood between them and their intended victims. Harry watched the scene through fading consciousness. The glowing Patronus moved along the edge of the lake, chasing the last remaining Dementors into the night. The creature's shape was unmistakable, though Harry struggled to understand how it had appeared. Just before he lost consciousness, he realized something strange. The Patronus looked like a stag, and for a brief moment, Harry believed he had seen someone standing across the lake casting the spell. Someone who looked almost exactly like his father. The events beside the lake marked a turning point in the strange presence the Dementors had maintained around Hogwarts for most of the school year. For months, the creatures had drifted along the boundaries of the castle grounds, acting as silent guards in the Ministry's search for Sirius Black. Their dark shapes had become a familiar sight in the distance, even if their presence continued to disturb many students and teachers. After the confrontation at the lake, however, the situation began to change. The truth about Sirius Black slowly came to light within the small circle of people who had witnessed what happened. The story that had been accepted throughout the wizarding world for years was no longer certain. Sirius had not been the traitor responsible for betraying the Potters. The real betrayer, Peter Pettigrew, had managed to escape once again before the Ministry could capture him. This revelation created a complicated problem. Officially, the Ministry of Magic still believed Sirius to be a dangerous criminal who had escaped from Azkaban. The authorities had no proof that the long-accepted story was wrong. Without Pettigrew to testify, there was no evidence strong enough to convince the Ministry that Sirius had been falsely accused. As a result, Sirius could not safely remain anywhere near Hogwarts. Even though he had avoided the Dementor's kiss at the lake, the creatures guarding the area would have quickly recognized him if he stayed. The Ministry had ordered the Dementors to capture him on sight, and their presence around the school meant that remaining in the region was too dangerous. Before the night ended, Sirius left the grounds of Hogwarts. With the help of those who now knew the truth about him, he escaped once again into the wider wizarding world. This time, however, he disappeared without any intention of returning to the prison that had held him for so many years. His departure marked the end of the immediate crisis surrounding Hogwarts. The Ministry had stationed Dementors around the school for one specific purpose: to capture the escaped prisoner believed to be hunting Harry Potter. Once Sirius vanished from the area, the creatures no longer had a clear reason to remain so close to the castle. Within days, the Ministry began reconsidering its strategy. Cornelius Fudge and his advisors recognized that leaving Dementors near a school had always been an uncomfortable solution. Reports of students experiencing fear, cold spells, and sudden waves of despair had reached the Ministry repeatedly throughout the year. Even if the creatures had technically obeyed their instructions, the risk they posed to the students had become increasingly obvious. Reluctantly, the Ministry decided to withdraw the Dementors from the immediate surroundings of Hogwarts. The creatures were ordered to return to their usual posts, guarding Azkaban. Slowly, the dark figures that had lingered along the edges of the school grounds began to disappear. The hills surrounding the castle once again became quiet, free from the silent patrols that had haunted them for months. For the students and teachers at Hogwarts, the change was immediate. The strange chill that had occasionally settled over the grounds faded away. Walks near the lake or through the open fields no longer carried the same uneasy feeling that had followed the Dementor's presence. Even the atmosphere inside the castle seemed lighter once the creatures had gone. Life at the school returned to something closer to normal, yet the events of the year had left a lasting impression on many people who had witnessed them. For the first time, students had seen the creatures of Azkaban not as distant legends, but as real beings capable of approaching their everyday lives. Harry felt this change more strongly than most. His encounters with the Dementors had forced him to confront memories he had never fully understood before. Through Lupin's lessons and the events beside the lake, he had learned how powerful the Patronus charm could be when used against them. More importantly, he had discovered something about himself. The Patronus that had driven the Dementors away that night had taken the shape of a stag, the same animal that represented his father's animagus form. Harry eventually realized that the wizard he had believed to be his father across the lake had actually been himself. Using a time turner to return to the moment and cast the spell, it was Harry's own magic that had saved them. This realization transformed the way he understood the creatures that had once terrified him. The Dementors remained dangerous, but they were no longer an unstoppable force. With the right spell and the strength of a powerful memory, they could be driven away. Meanwhile, far from Hogwarts, the fortress of Azkaban continued its grim routine. The Dementors returned to the prison where they had spent centuries guarding its stone corridors. Prisoners remained confined within the cold cells, and the creatures continued feeding on the despair that filled the fortress. Yet the escape of Sirius Black had already proven something important. Even the most secure prison in the wizarding world was not completely unbreakable, and the creatures guarding its walls were not as infallible as the Ministry had once believed. After the events surrounding Sirius Black's escape and the withdrawal of the Dementors from Hogwarts, the wizarding world slowly returned to a period of uneasy stability. The creatures once again gathered around the cold fortress of Azkaban, drifting through the prison corridors and along the outer towers just as they had for centuries. For the Ministry of Magic, this return to routine was reassuring. Yet beneath the surface, something important had changed. The escape of Sirius Black had exposed a weakness in the system that the Ministry had trusted for generations. Azkaban had always been considered completely secure, largely because of the Dementors guarding it. The creature's ability to drain hope and overwhelm prisoners was believed to make escape nearly impossible. Sirius had proven that belief was not entirely accurate. Although the Ministry did not publicly admit this flaw, the event forced officials to reconsider how much control they truly possessed over the creatures guarding the prison. For years, the relationship between the Ministry and the Dementors had been based on a fragile understanding. The creatures remained on the island because Azkaban provided them with a constant supply of despair. Prisoners created the emotional environment the Dementors needed, and in return, the creatures acted as the prison's silent guards. But this arrangement depended on one important assumption. It assumed that the Dementors had no reason to change their loyalty. The Ministry could issue instructions, and the creatures seemed to follow them, but no one had ever truly controlled them in the way one controls an employee or a trained magical creature. The Dementors tolerated the Ministry's authority because the prison suited their needs. If a stronger source of despair appeared elsewhere, their behavior might change. This possibility worried some officials within the Ministry. A few researchers who studied dark magical creatures had long argued that Dementors were unpredictable by nature. They were not guided by moral rules or political loyalty. Their only motivation was the pursuit of emotional energy. During the years following Sirius Black's escape, these concerns slowly grew stronger. Although Azkaban remained secure, reports began to suggest that the Dementors were becoming more restless. Some guards responsible for overseeing the prison claimed the creatures seemed more numerous than before. Others reported that the Dementors were gathering more frequently along the outer edges of the island, drifting toward the sea as if sensing something beyond the fortress. At first, these reports were dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. The Ministry had always believed that the island itself served as a natural containment zone for the creatures. The despair inside the prison should have been enough to keep them satisfied. There was no obvious reason for them to leave. Yet the wizarding world was changing again. In hidden corners of magical Britain, whispers began to circulate about the return of Lord Voldemort. Although the Ministry publicly denied these rumors for some time, the emotional atmosphere within wizarding society began to shift. Fear and uncertainty slowly spread through the community as strange events occurred and familiar patterns of dark magic began to reappear. For creatures like Dementors, such changes were impossible to ignore. They were drawn to despair in the same way a compass needle is drawn toward the north. As fear spread through the wizarding world, the emotional landscape that had once been concentrated inside Azkaban began to appear elsewhere. The Ministry's relationship with the creatures now faced a new test. If the Dementors sensed a greater source of despair outside the prison, they might eventually abandon the fortress altogether. The Ministry had no reliable method of forcing them to remain. The creatures had never sworn allegiance to wizarding authority. They had simply stayed where despair was strongest. For many years, that place had been Azkaban. But the growing darkness in the wizarding world suggested that the balance might soon shift. Voldemort's influence had once created an atmosphere of fear, powerful enough to reshape magical society. If that influence returned, the Dementors might begin to see new opportunities beyond the prison walls. Within the Ministry, these concerns remained largely private. Publicly, officials continued to reassure the wizarding community that Azkaban was secure and that the Dementors remained under control. Admitting uncertainty about the creatures guarding the prison could create panic among ordinary witches and wizards. Yet those who understood the nature of Dementors could already see the warning signs. The creatures had never been allies of the Ministry. They had simply been convenient. And as the shadow of Voldemort's return slowly spread across the wizarding world, the creatures of Azkaban would soon face a choice between the authority of the Ministry and the call of a darker master. As the whispers of Lord Voldemort's return began to spread through the wizarding world, the delicate balance that had kept the Dementors tied to Azkaban for generations slowly began to weaken. For centuries, the creatures had remained at the prison because it offered them what they desired most. The despair of prisoners filled the fortress like a constant supply of nourishment. As long as that source remained strong, the Dementors had little reason to seek anything beyond the island. But Voldemort understood the nature of dark creatures better than most wizards. During his earlier rise to power, he had already demonstrated a remarkable ability to attract beings that thrived in fear and chaos. Giants, werewolves, and other dangerous creatures had been drawn to his cause because his influence created the kind of world they preferred. Voldemort did not rely only on human followers. He understood that certain forces in the magical world could be persuaded without promises of loyalty or ideology. The Dementors were among those forces. As fear spread once again across magical Britain, the creatures guarding Azkaban began to sense a new source of despair beyond the prison walls. Rumors of disappearances, attacks, and dark magic filled the wizarding community with uncertainty. Each new report added to the emotional atmosphere that the Dementors fed upon. Gradually, the creatures became aware of something even more powerful than the misery of the prisoners. Voldemort himself had returned. Although his physical form remained weak at first, his influence over the wizarding world began growing quickly. Death Eaters, who had once served him in secret, started to reorganize, and the sense of danger that had haunted the previous war began to rise again. To creatures that fed on despair, this atmosphere was irresistible. The Ministry of Magic, however, refused to believe the truth for a long time. Many officials insisted that Voldemort had not truly returned. They dismissed reports from those who claimed to have seen him and argued that the wizarding world was simply experiencing a wave of rumors and fear. This refusal to acknowledge the danger had consequences. While the Ministry debated and delayed, Voldemort quietly began rebuilding his power. His followers operated in secret, spreading fear through carefully chosen attacks. The wizarding world grew increasingly uneasy as strange events occurred across magical Britain. The Dementors felt every shift in that emotional landscape. Inside Azkaban, their numbers had already grown large, but now their attention began turning outward. The fortress that had once satisfied them no longer represented the greatest concentration of despair. The world beyond the sea was changing. Eventually, Voldemort made his move. Rather than attempting to destroy the creatures guarding Azkaban, he offered them something far more appealing than their arrangement with the Ministry. He promised them freedom to roam beyond the prison and feed on the expanding fear throughout the wizarding world. For the Dementors, this was an offer perfectly aligned with their instincts. They had never cared about the Ministry's laws or the purpose of the prison they guarded. Their presence there had always been a matter of convenience. Voldemort's promise offered them something better, more despair. The shift happened quickly. Without warning, the Dementors abandoned their positions as guards of Azkaban. The creatures that had once drifted silently through the fortress corridors began leaving the island in large numbers. Instead of patrolling the prison walls, they moved outward into the wider wizarding world. The Ministry of Magic was caught completely unprepared. For generations, the prison had depended on the Dementors as its primary form of security. When the creatures disappeared, Azkaban lost the very force that had kept prisoners weak and hopeless. Without the creatures feeding on their despair, the prisoners suddenly found themselves free from the oppressive atmosphere that had defined life inside the fortress. This change had immediate consequences. Many of the prisoners held in Azkaban were former Death Eaters, individuals who had once served Voldemort during the First Wizarding War. With the Dementors gone, these prisoners regained the clarity of mind they had lacked for years. Before long, several of them escaped. The fortress that had once been considered the most secure prison in the wizarding world suddenly became vulnerable. Without the Dementors guarding it, the Ministry was forced to rely on ordinary magical defenses that had never been designed to hold so many dangerous criminals. Meanwhile, the Dementors themselves spread across magical Britain. They gathered in places where fear was strongest, drifting through dark forests, abandoned buildings, and remote villages. Wherever they appeared, the temperature dropped and a sense of despair settled over the surrounding area. Many of these creatures eventually aligned themselves directly with Voldemort's growing forces. Although they did not serve him in the same way the Death Eaters did, their presence strengthened the atmosphere of fear that surrounded his movement. Entire regions of the wizarding world became colder and darker under their influence. For the Ministry, this development represented one of the most serious failures in its history. The creatures they had once depended upon as prison guards had now joined the enemy. Worse still, the Ministry had no reliable way to force the Dementors back into Azkaban. The fragile arrangement that had lasted for centuries had finally collapsed. The Dementors had chosen their side. When the Dementors abandoned Azkaban and spread across the wizarding world, the consequences were immediate and unsettling. For centuries, the creatures had remained largely confined to the island prison, their influence restricted to the despair of those imprisoned there. Now they drifted freely through magical Britain, bringing their unnatural cold wherever they appeared. The Ministry of Magic had never faced a situation like this before. Without the Dementors guarding Azkaban, the prison itself became far less secure. The fortress still stood on its isolated island in the cold northern sea, surrounded by high walls and powerful protective enchantments. Yet those defenses had always been secondary. The true strength of Azkaban had been the creatures that drained prisoners of hope and strength. With that protection gone, the prison felt strangely hollow. Prison guards reported that the atmosphere inside the fortress had changed dramatically. The crushing despair that once filled every corridor slowly lifted. Prisoners who had spent years in a haze of misery began to think more clearly again. For some inmates, this clarity brought regret and exhaustion. For others, it brought opportunity. Many of the prisoners held inside Azkaban were dangerous witches and wizards who had served Voldemort during the First Wizarding War. During their years under the influence of the Dementors, they had grown weak and disoriented, unable to focus on escape. Now, their minds began to recover. Several of these prisoners soon found ways to flee the fortress. Each escape further weakened the Ministry's confidence in the prison system that had once seemed unbreakable. Reports of former Death Eaters returning to Voldemort's side began appearing across the wizarding world. The loss of the Dementors had turned Azkaban from an impregnable prison into a vulnerable outpost. Meanwhile, the Dementors themselves were spreading into new territories. The creatures did not organize their movements like human armies. They drifted across the land following the emotional currents of fear and despair. Wherever those emotions were strongest, the Dementors gathered. Some appeared near isolated villages, where their presence filled the air with a chilling stillness. Others lingered around remote roads or forests, creating regions where travelers felt sudden waves of hopelessness without understanding why. Even the weather seemed affected by their presence. Clouds gathered more frequently in areas where the creatures congregated. Sunlight dimmed, and the temperature dropped in ways that felt unnatural. These effects made it easy to sense when Dementors were nearby, even if the creatures themselves remained hidden. For ordinary witches and wizards, these changes created a growing sense of unease. Families who once felt safe within their homes began noticing strange cold drafts and unexplained feelings of sadness. The ministry attempted to reassure the public that the situation was under control, but those assurances grew less convincing as the months passed. Albus Dumbledore understood the danger more clearly than most. He had always warned that the ministry's reliance on Dementors was a mistake. Creatures that fed on despair could never truly be trusted as allies of a government that claimed to protect its citizens. Now the consequences of that decision were becoming obvious. As the war against Voldemort intensified, the Dementors became an invisible force, spreading fear throughout the country. Their presence strengthened the emotional darkness Voldemort relied upon to expand his influence. Every frightened whisper and every rumor of attack created more despair for the creatures to consume. In response, the Order of the Phoenix began preparing defenses against them. Members of the Order trained witches and wizards to use the Patronus charm whenever possible. Unlike ordinary defensive spells, the Patronus could repel Dementors completely, driving them away with the power of concentrated happiness. However, mastering the spell was not easy. Many people found it difficult to summon the necessary memory while surrounded by the despair the creatures created. Only those with strong emotional control could produce a Patronus powerful enough to force the Dementors back. Even so, the charm remained the best defense available. Throughout the wizarding world, small groups of witches and wizards practiced the spell in secret gatherings. The glowing silver shapes of Patronuses occasionally appeared in hidden fields or quiet forests as people prepared themselves for encounters with the creatures. Despite these efforts, the Dementors continued to spread. Their allegiance to Voldemort was never formally declared, yet their behavior clearly benefited his cause. The creatures did not attack in the way Death Eaters did, but their presence weakened communities and deepened the atmosphere of fear surrounding the war. For Voldemort, this was exactly what he needed. He had gained an ally that required no orders, no payment, and no loyalty. The Dementors served him simply by existing within the world he was creating. And as the conflict between Voldemort and the forces opposing him grew closer to its final stage, the creatures that once guarded Azkaban had become another shadow drifting across the wizarding world. As the war against Voldemort intensified, the presence of Dementors across magical Britain became one of the most unsettling features of the conflict. Unlike Death Eaters, who attacked openly with spells and violence, the Dementors spread something quieter and far more difficult to confront. Wherever they gathered, hope seemed to drain from the surrounding area. Villages that had once been lively places began to feel strangely subdued. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became rare. Even on clear days, the air in certain places felt heavy, as if a silent storm were hanging over the land. People often realized the cause only when they spotted the dark shapes drifting in the distance. The creatures did not rush or pursue targets in the way ordinary enemies might. Instead, they floated slowly through the landscape, moving toward the strongest sources of emotion. Large gatherings of frightened people, places recently affected by attacks, and communities struggling under the threat of war all attracted their attention. Each appearance deepened the sense of dread already spreading through the wizarding world. For the Ministry of Magic, controlling this situation proved extremely difficult. Officials issued warnings about Dementor activity in various regions, but those warnings rarely helped people understand how to defend themselves. The Patronus charm remained the only reliable protection, and many witches and wizards still lacked the skill to cast it effectively. Auras trained in the spell were dispatched to areas where the creatures had gathered, but the Dementors were not easily driven away. They did not fear most forms of magic. Stunning spells and protective barriers had little effect on them. Only the bright force of a Patronus could repel them with certainty, and even then the creatures usually retreated only a short distance before drifting elsewhere. The result was a constant shifting pattern of unease. Communities that felt safe one week sometimes found themselves facing the cold presence of Dementors the next. Reports spread quickly through the wizarding world as families warned one another about regions where the creatures had appeared. Some witches and wizards chose to leave their homes entirely, seeking refuge in areas believed to be safer. Others attempted to defend their communities by learning the Patronus charm together. In quiet fields outside villages, groups gathered to practice summoning their happiest memories. The silver glow of early Patronuses often flickered uncertainly in the air as people struggled to hold on to joy while fear surrounded them. Despite the difficulty, these efforts slowly strengthened the resistance against the creatures. Members of the Order of the Phoenix played an important role in guiding these preparations. Many of them were skilled in defensive magic and understood the true nature of Dementors better than most. They traveled between communities, teaching others how to protect themselves and reminding people that the creatures could be driven away. One lesson became especially important. The Patronus charm was not simply a spell of defense. It required the wizard casting it to focus on genuine happiness, something that could feel almost impossible during a time of war. Yet that happiness represented the exact opposite of what the Dementors needed to survive. Every successful Patronus reminded people that despair did not have to dominate the world around them. At Hogwarts, students continued to hear occasional reports of Dementor activity beyond the school grounds. Although the creatures no longer patrolled the castle's perimeter as they once had, the war unfolding across magical Britain still reached the ears of those studying within the ancient walls. Harry Potter understood the danger these creatures represented better than most of his classmates. Through his encounters with them in earlier years, he had learned both the terror they inspired and the method required to resist them. The Patronus charm he had once struggled to produce had grown into one of his strongest abilities. That skill would soon become valuable in ways he could not yet predict. As Voldemort's forces gathered strength, the emotional atmosphere of the wizarding world continued to darken. Fear spread through the population, and the Dementors followed wherever that fear appeared. The creatures did not understand the political goals of the war. They did not care about the ambitions of Voldemort or the resistance formed by the Order of the Phoenix. Their role in the conflict was simpler and far more instinctive. They fed on the despair created by the war itself. And as long as that despair continued to grow, the shadow of the Dementors would remain across the wizarding world. As Voldemort's influence continued to grow, the presence of Dementors became more closely tied to the changing structure of power within the wizarding world. The creatures had already abandoned Azkaban and spread across magical Britain, but their role in the conflict soon deepened as Voldemort's control over the Ministry of Magic strengthened. For a time, the Ministry had attempted to maintain the appearance of authority. Officials continued issuing statements about security and public safety, even as the war slowly expanded. Yet behind those public reassurances, Voldemort's followers were quietly gaining influence within the government itself. Key positions inside the Ministry began to fall under the control of individuals loyal to the Dark Lord. When the Ministry finally came under Voldemort's direct influence, the balance of power changed dramatically. The government that had once opposed him now operated under his command. Laws were altered, authority shifted, and the institutions that had once resisted dark magic began serving the interests of the new regime. For the Dementors, this transformation created a strange situation. They had already aligned themselves with Voldemort's growing presence because of the despair surrounding his rise. Now the official government of the wizarding world no longer opposed them. The creatures that had once been considered dangerous allies of the Dark Lord were suddenly tolerated once again by the Ministry. In a grim twist of history, the Ministry resumed using the Dementors as guards for Azkaban. The prison had struggled without them, escapes had become more frequent, and the weakened defenses had placed enormous pressure on the remaining guards. Restoring the creatures to their old role seemed like the simplest solution, even if it meant accepting their connection to Voldemort's influence. The Dementors returned to the fortress willingly. For them, the arrangement was familiar. Azkaban still held prisoners filled with fear, regret, and despair. The island prison once again offered a concentrated supply of the emotional energy they required. Yet the creatures were no longer confined in the same way they had been before. Now they existed within a world dominated by Voldemort's authority. Their loyalty to the Ministry was little more than a reflection of his control. If the situation changed again, the creatures would likely follow the strongest source of despair, just as they had before. Within Azkaban, the return of the Dementors restored the oppressive atmosphere that had defined the prison for centuries. The cold corridors once again filled with the silent movement of the hooded figures. Prisoners who had briefly regained clarity during the creature's absence found themselves slipping back into the same emotional darkness that had once drained their strength. The fortress resumed its grim routine. Outside the prison walls, however, the wizarding world continued to change. The regime controlling the Ministry began enforcing new policies designed to strengthen Voldemort's authority. Fear spread through magical communities as new laws targeted individuals suspected of resisting the government. Families who had once felt secure found themselves living under increasing suspicion. In this atmosphere, the Dementors remained both a symbol and a tool of oppression. Their presence around Azkaban reminded the wizarding world of the consequences faced by those who opposed the new order. The creatures guarding the prison represented the same despair that Voldemort relied upon to maintain control. Yet even under these conditions, resistance continued to grow. Members of the Order of the Phoenix and other groups working against Voldemort operated in secret across the country. They spread information, protected vulnerable families, and prepared for the possibility of a final confrontation. Among those resisting the new regime was Harry Potter. Though he was no longer living openly within the wizarding world, his struggle against Voldemort had become central to the conflict unfolding around him. Every decision he made carried consequences for the future of magical Britain. The Dementors, drifting through the skies near Azkaban or gathering around places filled with fear, remained part of that larger struggle. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They followed no strategy and obeyed no commander with true loyalty. Their presence simply reflected the emotional landscape of the world around them. And as long as fear and despair dominated that landscape, the creatures would continue to drift through the darkness of the wizarding war. As the war moved closer to its final stage, the atmosphere across the wizarding world grew darker than it had been at any time since Voldemort's original rise to power. Fear spread through magical Britain as communities struggled under the weight of uncertainty. Families disappeared from their homes. News of attacks traveled quietly between villages and towns. In this environment, the Dementors continued drifting through the skies, drawn again and again to places where despair was strongest. Their presence no longer shocked people in the way it once had. Instead, the creatures became a grim symbol of the world Voldemort was creating. When a Dementor appeared near a settlement, people understood immediately that something was wrong. The temperature would fall suddenly, the air would feel heavy and silent. Even those who could not see the creatures often sensed them through the strange emptiness that followed their arrival. In many areas, small groups of witches and wizards learned to watch the sky carefully. If the dark figures appeared on the horizon, people prepared their defenses. Those capable of producing a Patronus gathered in the open spaces of their communities. The silver light of protective magic would flare briefly as they pushed the creatures away from homes and streets. Yet the Dementors rarely disappeared entirely. They drifted away slowly, lingering at the edges of forests or hills before moving towards some other source of despair. Their movements resembled dark currents flowing through the air, always searching for emotional energy strong enough to feed upon. Throughout this period, the Ministry of Magic remained under Voldemort's control. The government continued presenting itself as a legitimate authority while quietly enforcing policies designed to strengthen the Dark Lord's rule. Many officials who opposed this direction had already fled or been forced into hiding. The return of the Dementors to Azkaban became part of this new system. The prison once again operated with the creatures drifting through its towers and corridors. Prisoners who resisted the regime often found themselves transported to the fortress, where the presence of the Dementors drained away their hope and strength. For the regime controlling the ministry, this arrangement served a clear purpose. Fear remained one of the most effective tools for maintaining control. The knowledge that Azkaban still held the creatures that could destroy a person's spirit was enough to discourage many forms of resistance. Yet beyond the walls of the prison, another movement was quietly growing. The Order of the Phoenix and other resistance groups continued their efforts to oppose Voldemort's rule. They shared information through secret channels, protected those being hunted by the Ministry, and prepared for the possibility of a final confrontation. Harry Potter played a central role in that effort. Although he moved through the wizarding world in secrecy, the knowledge of his resistance spread quietly among those who opposed Voldemort. His name became a symbol of hope, reminding people that the Dark Lord's power was not absolute. This hope had an unexpected effect on the creatures drifting through the war. Dementors thrived in despair, but hope created something they could not easily consume. In areas where resistance groups strengthened the spirits of those around them, the creatures often struggled to maintain their presence. A powerful Patronus could drive them away completely. Across magical Britain, the silver glow of Patronuses began appearing more frequently as the conflict intensified. Each successful defense against the creatures represented a small victory over the darkness spreading through the wizarding world. These moments reminded people that despair did not have to define their future. The Dementors continued drifting through the skies, but they were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed to be. The knowledge of how to repel them had spread widely enough that entire communities could now defend themselves if necessary. Even so, the creatures remained a constant reminder of the war. They moved silently above forests and villages, feeding on the fear created by Voldemort's campaign. Their dark shapes against the clouds served as a warning that the conflict was still far from over. But beneath those shadows, the determination of those resisting the Dark Lord continued to grow stronger with each passing day. As the final year of the war unfolded, the wizarding world moved steadily toward a confrontation that many had long feared, but few fully understood. Voldemort's influence had spread through the Ministry. Azkaban once again held prisoners beneath the shadow of Dementors, and much of magical Britain lived under the quiet pressure of fear. Yet beneath that darkness, resistance had continued to grow. Throughout the country, small groups of witches and wizards worked together in secret. Some protected families being targeted by the regime. Others passed information between communities or offered safe places for those forced to hide. The Order of the Phoenix remained at the center of these efforts, though many people who had never been formal members of the group joined the struggle in their own way. In this shifting landscape, the Dementors continued to drift through the skies like silent witnesses to the war. The creatures remained concentrated around Azkaban and in areas where fear was strongest, but they were no longer confined to a single purpose. Their movements reflected the emotional currents spreading through the wizarding world. Whenever despair deepened in a region, the creatures appeared. Villages struck by raids from Death Eaters sometimes found the cold presence of Dementors nearby soon afterward. The creatures did not cause the attacks, but they were drawn to the emotional aftermath. Fear, grief, and uncertainty created the environment the creatures needed. For those who experienced such moments, the effect could be overwhelming. The temperature would drop suddenly. Conversations would stop as a heavy silence filled the air. Some people described the feeling as though a shadow had passed over their thoughts, leaving only emptiness behind. Yet more and more witches and wizards had begun preparing themselves for exactly this situation. Knowledge of the Patronus charm had spread throughout the wizarding world. Though the spell remained difficult to master, many communities had begun training together, helping one another strengthen their ability to produce the Silver Guardians capable of driving the creatures away. In quiet fields beyond villages, the glow of Patronuses sometimes appeared like distant stars against the evening sky. Each successful spell carried a message that spread quickly among those resisting Voldemort's rule. The Dementors could be repelled. The despair they fed upon did not have to dominate every corner of the world. These lessons became especially important as rumors of a coming battle began to circulate. Word spread quietly through hidden networks that Voldemort was preparing to move directly against Hogwarts. The ancient school had long represented a place of learning and protection within the wizarding world. If the conflict reached the castle itself, it would signal that the war had entered its final stage. For the Dementors drifting through the skies, such a moment promised an enormous surge of emotion. Battles created fear, loss, and uncertainty on a scale few other events could match. Creatures that fed on despair naturally moved towards such disturbances. Yet the defenders of Hogwarts were not unaware of this possibility. Professors, members of the Order of the Phoenix, and older students prepared the castle's defenses carefully. Magical barriers were strengthened, protective spells were placed across the grounds, and those capable of casting Patronuses stood ready to use them if the creatures approached. When the confrontation finally began, the emotional energy surrounding the battle was immense. The skies above the castle filled with the sound of spells and the movement of defenders racing across the grounds. Fear and determination mixed together in equal measure as witches and wizards fought to protect the school. In the distance, some witnesses reported seeing dark shapes drifting along the horizon. The Dementors had sensed the battle. Yet the defenders of Hogwarts carried with them something the creatures could not easily overcome. Many of those fighting for the castle did so with powerful memories of friendship, loyalty, and the determination to protect one another. Those emotions formed the very foundation of the Patronus charm. Whenever a Dementor attempted to move closer to the battle, bright silver shapes appeared in response. Stags, otters, wolves, and countless other Patronuses surged into the air, pushing the creatures back before they could feed on the despair surrounding the conflict. In this way, the creatures that had once terrified the wizarding world were forced to remain at a distance. The final battle would not belong to them. The struggle unfolding at Hogwarts was being decided by witches and wizards alone, guided by courage rather than the darkness the Dementors sought to consume. After the final battle at Hogwarts ended and Voldemort's power collapsed, the atmosphere across the wizarding world began to change in ways that had not been possible for many years. The long period of fear that had shaped daily life slowly began to lift. Communities that had lived under constant tension started to rebuild their sense of safety and stability. For the Dementors, this shift carried enormous consequences. The creatures had thrived during the years of conflict because war created exactly the emotional conditions they required. Fear, grief, uncertainty, and loss had spread across magical Britain, providing the despair that drew them from Azkaban and scattered them across the country. Now that the war was over, the emotional landscape of the wizarding world began to transform. Hope returned gradually to communities that had once lived in darkness. Families reunited with loved ones who had survived the conflict. Villages repaired damaged homes and reopened shops that had been closed during the worst periods of the war. As these changes spread, the environment that had attracted the Dementors slowly weakened. The creatures still existed, of course. They had not disappeared with the fall of Voldemort. Yet the strong currents of despair that had once guided their movements began to fade. Without those emotional signals, the creatures drifted more quietly through the world. The new leadership within the Ministry of Magic understood that the time had come to reconsider how these creatures should be handled. For generations, the Ministry had relied on Dementors as the primary guards of Azkaban. That arrangement had always been controversial among those who studied dark magical creatures. But the prison's reputation for security had made the system seem practical. The events of the war proved how dangerous that reliance had been. When the Dementors chose to abandon Azkaban and follow Voldemort's growing influence, the Ministry lost control of one of its most important institutions. Prisoners escaped, and the creatures themselves became part of the forces spreading fear across magical Britain. The lesson was clear. A government dedicated to protecting its people could not depend on creatures that fed on despair. In the years following the war, the Ministry began exploring new methods of guarding Azkaban without the help of Dementors. Magical defenses surrounding the prison were strengthened, and trained auras were assigned to monitor the fortress and the sea around it. The goal was to create a prison that relied on skill and vigilance, rather than the presence of creatures that thrived on suffering. Meanwhile, the Dementors themselves retreated from many of the areas they had occupied during the conflict. Without the concentrated despair created by war, the creatures drifted back toward remote and isolated regions, where strong emotions still lingered. Some remained near Azkaban, drawn by the memories of the prison that had once sustained them. Others moved into distant parts of the magical world, where human communities rarely traveled. Unlike many magical creatures, Dementors were not bound to a single place or society. They existed wherever despair could be found. If the emotional balance of the world changed again, they could easily return to more populated regions. For this reason, witches and wizards continued to study the Patronus charm even after the war ended. The knowledge that a bright memory could repel the creatures remained an important part of magical defense. Students at Hogwarts continued learning the spell, just as Harry Potter had once learned it under Professor Lupin's guidance. The Patronus charm became more than a defensive spell. It became a reminder that even the darkest creatures in the wizarding world could be driven away by hope and determination. The silver glow of a Patronus represented something deeper than magic alone. It represented the strength of the human spirit. In this way, the legacy of the Dementors became tied not only to fear, but also to resilience. The creatures would always exist somewhere within the magical world, drifting through places where despair gathered. But witches and wizards now understood more clearly than ever before how to face them. The war had revealed that darkness could be resisted, and the memory of that lesson would remain long after the last shadow of the Dementors faded into the distance. In the years following the fall of Voldemort, the wizarding world slowly entered a quieter era. The great conflict that had shaped an entire generation came to an end, and the long shadow that had hung over magical Britain began to lift. Communities rebuilt what had been damaged during the war, and people who had once lived in fear started rediscovering ordinary moments of peace. Yet even as life returned to something closer to normal, the memory of the Dementors remained deeply woven into the history of that time. For centuries, the creatures had existed at the edge of wizarding society, rarely discussed in everyday conversation. They had been known primarily as the silent guardians of Azkaban, drifting through the prison's cold towers, while prisoners suffered under their presence. The war changed how people understood them. The events surrounding Sirius Black's escape, the withdrawal of the creatures from Hogwarts, and their later alliance with Voldemort revealed that the Dementors had never truly belonged to the Ministry of Magic. They were not allies, soldiers, or servants. They were simply creatures that followed despair. This realization reshaped how many witches and wizards thought about the balance between magic and responsibility. The decision to rely on Dementors as prison guards had once seemed practical. After the war, that choice appeared far more dangerous. A society that depended on despair to maintain order had allowed darkness to exist at the center of its own institutions. In the years that followed, Hogwarts and other magical schools placed greater emphasis on defensive magic that protected against such creatures. Students continued learning the Patronus charm, not only as a practical skill, but also as a reminder of what the spell represented. A Patronus required the caster to focus on genuine happiness. That requirement carried an important lesson. While many forms of magic depended on concentration or knowledge, the Patronus relied on emotion. It drew strength from hope, friendship, and love. Those same emotions had proven powerful enough to resist the creatures that fed on despair. Harry Potter's own experiences with Dementors became part of that lesson. His first encounter with them, on the Hogwarts Express, had nearly overwhelmed him. The memory of his mother's final moments had been too strong for him to face at the time. Yet through patience and guidance, he had learned to transform that painful memory into a source of strength. The Patronus he eventually produced, shaped like a stag, carried the legacy of his father and the love that had protected him as a child. That moment beside the lake demonstrated something important about the nature of the creatures he had once feared. Even the deepest despair could be driven away by a single, powerful memory. Across the wizarding world, stories like that one continued to circulate among younger generations of students. They were told not simply as tales of magical skill, but as reminders of how darkness could be confronted. The Dementors themselves never truly vanished. Some still lingered in distant regions of the magical world, drifting quietly through places where sorrow and loneliness gathered. Others remained near Azkaban, drawn by the lingering echoes of despair that the prison had contained for centuries. But they no longer stood at the center of wizarding society. The creatures that once symbolized the Ministry's authority had become something different. They were now understood as forces of nature within the magical world, dangerous but predictable in their behavior. And because witches and wizards had learned how to resist them, the creatures no longer held the same power over people's lives. In quiet classrooms at Hogwarts, students practicing the Patronus charm sometimes watched the silver shapes of their spells race through the air. Each glowing guardian represented the same simple truth that had guided the wizarding world through its darkest years. Despair could exist, but it did not have to win. In the years following the fall of Voldemort, the wizarding world slowly entered a quieter era. The great conflict that had shaped an entire generation came to an end, and the long shadow that had hung over magical Britain began to lift. Communities rebuilt what had been damaged during the war, and people who had once lived in fear started rediscovering ordinary moments of peace. Yet, even as life returned to something closer to normal, the memory of the Dementors remained deeply woven into the history of that time. For centuries, the creatures had existed at the edge of wizarding society, rarely discussed in everyday conversation. They had been known primarily as the silent guardians of Azkaban, drifting through the prison's cold towers while prisoners suffered under their presence. The war changed how people understood them. The events surrounding Sirius Black's escape, the withdrawal of the creatures from Hogwarts, and their later alliance with Voldemort revealed that the Dementors had never truly belonged to the Ministry of Magic. They were not allies, soldiers, or servants. They were simply creatures that followed despair. This realization reshaped how many witches and wizards thought about the balance between magic and responsibility. The decision to rely on Dementors as prison guards had once seemed practical. After the war, that choice appeared far more dangerous. A society that depended on despair to maintain order had allowed darkness to exist at the center of its own institutions. In the years that followed, Hogwarts and other magical schools placed greater emphasis on defensive magic that protected against such creatures. Students continued learning the Patronus charm not only as a practical skill, but also as a reminder of what the spell represented. A Patronus required the caster to focus on genuine happiness. That requirement carried an important lesson. While many forms of magic depended on concentration or knowledge, the Patronus relied on emotion. It drew strength from hope, friendship, and love. Those same emotions had proven powerful enough to resist the creatures that fed on despair. Harry Potter's own experiences with Dementors became part of that lesson. His first encounter with them on the Hogwarts Express had nearly overwhelmed him. The memory of his mother's final moments had been too strong for him to face at the time. Yet through patience and guidance, he had learned to transform that painful memory into a source of strength. The Patronus he eventually produced, shaped like a stag, carried the legacy of his father and the love that had protected him as a child. That moment beside the lake demonstrated something important about the nature of the creatures he had once feared. Even the deepest despair could be driven away by a single powerful memory. Across the wizarding world, stories like that one continued to circulate among younger generations of students. They were told not simply as tales of magical skill, but as reminders of how darkness could be confronted. The Dementors themselves never truly vanished. Some still lingered in distant regions of the magical world, drifting quietly through places where sorrow and loneliness gathered. Others remained near Azkaban, drawn by the lingering echoes of despair that the prison had contained for centuries. But they no longer stood at the center of wizarding society. The creatures that once symbolized the Ministry's authority had become something different. They were now understood as forces of nature within the magical world, dangerous but predictable in their behavior. And because witches and wizards had learned how to resist them, the creatures no longer held the same power over people's lives. In quiet classrooms at Hogwarts, students practicing the Patronus charm sometimes watched the silver shapes of their spells race through the air. Each glowing guardian represented the same simple truth that had guided the wizarding world through its darkest years. Despair could exist, but it did not have to win.